Tonight, picture a city that has just finished its supper. It is the 7th of September, 1940, a Saturday, and London is having one of those warm, late summer evenings that arrive after the schools have gone back and feel like a small gift nobody asked for. The plane trees along the embankment are still in full leaf, dusty and heavy, hanging over the pavements like green umbrellas that have been left out too long. The tide is high on the Thames, and the water is the color of weak tea. In the streets behind the docks, the front doors stand open because the houses are still holding the heat of the afternoon, and the smell of the river comes up the alleys with the smell of sugar from the refineries and tar from the wharves, and underneath it all, the ordinary Saturday smell of frying onions. People are sitting out on their steps. Somebody is winding a gramophone. In the back gardens, half-buried humps of corrugated steel sit under mounds of turf, and marrows are growing on top of some of them, because if a person is handed a lump of curved metal and told to bury it in the vegetable patch, that person will eventually plant something on the roof of it. Nobody is looking at the sky. The sky is a soft, tired blue, going gold at the edges, and it is the last evening of its kind for a very long time. That is where we are going tonight. Not to a single night, and not to a single street, but all the way through. From the first uneasy arguments about whether the air above a country could ever really be defended, to the last siren that ever sounded over these islands, and then on past the end to the willow herb growing pink and shoulder-high in the empty places, and the new towers going up over the old cellars. We are going to spend the whole of it together, slowly, in order, one year after another. And there is a great deal of it, which is precisely the point. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself. Let the lamp go low, or let it go out altogether. Let the pillow take the weight of your head properly, so that your neck is not doing any work at all. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been sitting all day, and let your hands go loose. And let the small weight of the day slip down off you 1 quiet inch at a time, the way a blanket slides off a chair. You do not need to remember any of this. That is worth saying plainly at the start, because a story with dates in it can make a tired mind feel like it ought to be taking notes, and there is nothing here to take notes about. There is no test. There is nothing you need to keep hold of. If you drift off in the middle of the second winter, you have not missed anything, because the second winter will still be there tomorrow night, and so will the first one, and so will the spring after it. All of this already happened. It finished a long time ago. Every single person in it has already done whatever they were going to do. And none of it needs anything from you tonight, except that you let it go on quietly in the background while you fall asleep. If you enjoy these long, slow histories, you are very welcome to leave a like or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and honestly, only once you have slept. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It is a small thing, but it helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is something companionable about scrolling past a list of towns and villages and cities where somebody else is also lying awake at 3 a.m. on the other side of the world, listening to the same voice. Now, before there was a Blitz, there was an argument. It is an argument that begins long before any bomb fell on London, in a period when the sky over Britain was still, as far as anybody was concerned, simply weather. For most of human history, the top of the country was not a place anything could come from. Invasion came by sea. That was the whole shape of British anxiety for 1,000 years. And it is why the coast is stitched with castles and forts and Martello towers and Victorian gun batteries, all of them pointed outward at the water, all of them built on the reasonable assumption that anybody who wanted to hurt you would have to get their feet wet first. The channel was the moat. The Navy was the wall. And above the wall, there was nothing but gulls. To understand what happened in 1940, you have to go back to the moment that stopped being true, which was, very roughly, a cold January night in 1915. That night, two enormous airships came in over the Norfolk coast. They were Zeppelins, which is to say they were gas bags the length of a street, rigid frames of aluminium alloy wrapped in cotton floating on hydrogen, with little cabins slung underneath where men in leather coats sat and shivered and navigated by looking down at the shape of the darkened land. They came in low and slow across the salt marshes, and they dropped bombs on Great Yarmouth and on King's Lynn, and they killed 4 people, and then they turned around and went home. 4 people. In the accounting of the century that followed, 4 is nothing, a rounding error, a number so small that it disappears. But it was the first time in the whole long history of these islands that death had arrived from directly overhead, delivered to civilians in their own front rooms by an enemy who had never had to land. And the shock of it went through the country like cold water. Something that everybody had always known was true had quietly stopped being true, and nobody had been consulted about it. Over the next 3 years, the airships came back again and again on the dark nights when there was no moon, drifting over Yorkshire and the Midlands and the East Coast, occasionally getting as far as London. They were absurdly vulnerable in hindsight. They were vast bags of flammable gas, moving at the speed of a fast bicycle, and once the defenders worked out how to climb high enough and load their guns with the right ammunition, the airships began to burn spectacularly and publicly in front of large crowds of people who had come out of their houses in their nightclothes to watch. It was, by every account, one of the strangest sights anyone in Britain had ever seen. A burning ship the size of a cathedral coming down very slowly out of the dark over Hertfordshire, lighting up the fields for miles. But the airships were only the opening. What followed them was worse, because what followed them was aeroplanes, and aeroplanes were not a novelty act. In the spring of 1917, large twin-engine bombers began coming across the channel in formation, in daylight, and they came for Folkestone first, and then they came for London. On a bright morning in the middle of June, a formation of them flew up the Thames in broad daylight, in full view of an entire city, and bombed the streets around Liverpool Street Station. And one of the bombs went through the roof of a school in Poplar and down into an infant's classroom. 18 small children died there. The funeral filled the streets. It is a hard thing to say gently, and I am going to say it once and then move on, because we are not here tonight to sit in the worst rooms. But it matters to the story, because that single morning did more to shape the next 25 years of British policy than almost anything else in the war. It convinced a generation of politicians and planners of one simple and terrible idea, that in any future war, the bombers would come. They would come for the cities, and there would be no stopping them. By the end of the Great War, something like 1,400 people in Britain had been killed by air attack. Set against the losses in France, it was a small figure. But it was a small figure with an enormous shadow, because everybody who studied it drew the same conclusion, which was that the numbers would not stay small. Aircraft were getting bigger every year. Bomb loads were doubling. In 1918, a bomber could carry a few hundred pounds of explosive across the channel. What would it carry in 1930? In 1940? The men who thought about this for a living came up with answers that were, it turned out, wildly wrong, but wrong in a direction that shaped everything. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the accepted expert view was that a future air war would begin with a knockout blow, an enormous fleet of bombers arriving over London within hours of a declaration, dropping high explosive and gas, and reducing a modern city to something unlivable in a matter of days. Estimates were produced. The estimates were staggering. Committees calculated that London might suffer casualties in the hundreds of thousands within the first weeks, and that hospitals would be overwhelmed, and that the survivors would flood out into the countryside in a panic that no government could control. One planning paper worked out how many square feet of timber would be needed for coffins, and concluded that there would not be enough timber, and suggested papier-mâché instead, and then suggested lime pits. In 1932, a former and future Prime Minister stood up in the House of Commons and told the country, in a phrase that everybody in Britain would still be repeating a decade later, that there was no power on earth that could protect the man in the street from being bombed, and that the bomber would always get through. It was a piece of honesty that landed like a stone in a pond, and the ripples never really stopped. So that is where we begin, not with an air raid, but with a fear. A fear that had been growing steadily for 20 years, in committee rooms, in newspaper columns, and popular novels, until by the middle of the 1930s it had become one of the defining anxieties of British life. As ordinary and as constant as the weather. The country was frightened of the sky. And in the last few years before the war, that fear stopped being an idea and started being an enormous, dull, practical to-do list, made of sandbags and stirrup pumps and corrugated steel and cardboard boxes containing 38 million rubber masks. We will go through that list slowly. It is, I think, one of the most soothing parts of the whole story, because it is entirely made of preparation, and preparation is a calm thing to listen to. It is people measuring and stacking and painting white stripes on curbstones and arguing about the correct depth of a hole. The organization that grew out of the fear was called Air Raid Precautions, and almost everybody shortened it to 3 letters. And for the rest of the war, those 3 letters were painted on helmets and armbands and the doors of little brick huts on street corners all over Britain. It began quietly in the middle of the 1930s as a small department inside the Home Office with a modest budget and a great deal of paper. It grew, slowly at first and then very fast, into something close to a second civil service, with more than 1.5 million people in it by the time the bombing started. The overwhelming majority of them part-time volunteers who did the job in the evenings after their proper work. Bank clerks, schoolmasters, retired sergeants, women who had run a household and a war garden and a widowed mother-in-law and correctly judged that supervising a street of 200 people would not be beyond them. The legislation came in 1937. It obliged every local authority in the country to make a plan. How many wardens, how many shelters, how many stretcher parties, where the first aid posts would be, where the dead would be taken, where the homeless would be fed. Councils that had spent the previous decade arguing about tram routes now found themselves working out how many hundredweight of sand a borough would need, and where to put it, and who would replace it when it got wet, which sand always does. Then came the autumn of 1938 and the crisis over Czechoslovakia. And for about a fortnight the whole country behaved as though the war were starting on Friday. That fortnight is worth sitting inside for a moment, because it is such a strange, vivid, almost dreamlike interval. Men went into the London parks with picks and shovels and dug slit trenches across the grass, zigzag lines of raw yellow clay opening up between the flower beds in Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens, while nannies pushed prams past them as usual. Barrage balloons were flown for the first time over the city, huge silver whales rising out of the recreation grounds on their cables, turning slowly, catching the sun. The great museums began crating up their treasures and sending them off to slate quarries in Wales and country houses in the West. Gas masks were distributed door to door in a hurry, in a system that had not been rehearsed by volunteers who had been shown how to fit them that same morning. And then it all stopped. An agreement was signed, an aeroplane came home, and the trenches in the parks stayed open all winter and filled with rain and leaves, and the balloons came down, and everybody went back to work feeling a mixture of relief and something else that took longer to name. The country had been given a year. Most people, whatever they said in public, seemed to have privately understood that a year was what it was. The year was spent on the whole digging. The most famous thing that came out of it was a curved sheet of corrugated, galvanized steel that arrived at people's houses in 6 pieces, flat-packed, with a bag of bolts, and which is remembered now under the name of the Home Secretary, who ordered it rather than the 2 engineers who actually designed it, which is a habit that tends to age badly for engineers. It was a beautifully simple thing. 2 curved sheets bolted together at the top to make an arch, flat plates at either end, one of them with a doorway cut in it. You dug a hole in your garden 4 feet deep, you stood the arch in the hole, you bolted it up, and then you shoveled at least 15 inches of earth over the top and banked it up the sides. It was free to any household earning less than £250 a year, which covered the great majority of working people, and it cost about £7 for anybody above that line. Something like 2.25 million of them were issued before the bombing began, and the number kept climbing all through the war. They were, by every honest account, cold, damp, cramped, and prone to flooding. The water table in much of London is not far down, and a hole 4 feet deep in a Bermondsey back garden becomes a small private pond by November. People bailed them out with saucepans. People lined them with duckboards and old lino and coconut matting. People built bunks along the sides out of scaffold planks and slept 2 adults and 3 children in a space roughly the size of a garden shed lying on its side, with condensation running down the steel a few inches from their faces. And yet, they worked. That is the thing that keeps being said about the humped steel arch in the vegetable patch. It was miserable, and it saved an enormous number of lives, because it did not need to stop a direct hit. Almost nothing stopped a direct hit. What it needed to stop was blast and flying brick and roof slate and glass, and it stopped all of those very well indeed, being a curved shape half buried in earth, which is the oldest good idea in the whole of engineering. People decorated them. This is one of my favorite small facts of the entire period. Householders whitewashed the insides. They hung pictures on nails driven into the ridge bolt. They put down rugs. They kept a paraffin lamp and a tin of biscuits and a pack of cards and a bottle of something for emergencies. with a very generous definition of emergency. They planted the earth roof, because a mound of bare clay in a small garden is an offense against tidiness, and by the second summer of the war there were Anderson shelters all over South London, growing lettuces, radishes, nasturtiums, and in at least one recorded case, a modest but productive crop of tomatoes. Alongside the steel arches came the masks. Nearly 38 million of them had been made and issued by the time war was declared, in 3 sizes, packed in little cardboard boxes with a length of string for a shoulder strap. The adult version was black rubber with a celluloid window and a cylindrical filter that smelled powerfully of rubber and charcoal and made a rude noise when you breathed out hard. A discovery that was made independently by every schoolchild in Britain within about 90 seconds of first putting one on. There was a smaller red and blue version for small children made deliberately cheerful, and a strange sealed helmet for babies that a parent had to keep working with a hand pump. The masks were carried everywhere for the first winter of the war. There were fines, in theory, for being caught without one. Shops sold decorated cases to carry them in leatherette and tartan and imitation crocodile, because the British commercial instinct does not sleep even when the country is expecting to be gassed. And then, gradually, as the months went by and no gas ever came, the boxes stayed at home more and more often, first on the hall table and then in the cupboard under the stairs, until, by the middle of the war, a person carrying a gas mask on a bus was slightly conspicuous, like somebody wearing a raincoat on a clear day. The gas never came. It is one of the great strange non-events of the century. The preparation for it was total, expensive, exhausting, and entirely unused, and the whole apparatus of it now sits in museum cases looking like equipment from a war that happened somewhere else. The last great preparation was the one that changed the look and feel of the country more than anything else, and it arrived 2 days before the war did. On the 1st of September, 1939, the blackout began and Britain simply turned its lights off. It is difficult now to feel the size of that. Every window and every house had to be covered after dusk so that no light showed outside at all. People bought heavy black cloth, and it sold out, and then they bought dark blue and dark green and brown. And they nailed up battens and made frames out of plywood and stuck sheets of black paper over the glass with drawing pins. Street lamps went out and stayed out, shop windows went dark, car headlamps were fitted with masks that let out only a thin horizontal slot of light pointed downward. Traffic lights were reduced to a small cross of colored light in a black mask. Railway carriages ran with a single dim blue bulb. Even torches had to be dimmed with 2 layers of tissue paper and pointed at the pavement. And the effect of it was that the sky came back. That is the detail that turns up again and again in the letters and diaries of the first blackout autumn, and it has nothing to do with bombing at all. People walked out of their front doors into a city that had been lit continuously for a century and a half, and looked up and saw stars. Londoners who had lived their whole lives under a permanent orange glow saw the Milky Way from their own back steps. The countryside, which had never been very bright to begin with, went absolutely black under a sky so thick with stars it looked like frost. There was a brief, widely reported enthusiasm for astronomy. Amateur societies took on new members. It did not last, but for a few weeks in the autumn of 1939, a substantial number of people in Britain discovered that they lived under an enormous, quiet ceiling of light that their grandparents had known well and they had never once seen. The blackout also, it must be said, was lethal. In its first 4 months, road deaths went up sharply because a man in a dark overcoat stepping off a curb into a road containing a car with 2 thin slots of light is a physics problem with only one answer. People walked into canals, off station platforms, into rivers and ponds and unlit lampposts. Curbstones were painted with white stripes. Trees in parks got white rings. Pillar boxes got white tops. Men took to carrying newspapers under their arms with the pale side out so that they showed up, and to smoking on the theory that the tip of a cigarette was better than nothing at all. On the same weekend that the lights went out, the children left. The evacuation had been planned for years and rehearsed in the crisis the previous autumn, and when the order finally went out at the end of August 1939, it moved with a speed that still seems remarkable. In 3 days, something close to 1.5 million people were carried out of the cities and into the countryside, school children with their teachers. Mothers with babies under school age, expectant mothers, blind and disabled people, and whole hospital wards. They went in special trains, hundreds and hundreds of special trains, timetabled months in advance, running out of the great stations in a continuous stream from early morning until the light went. The image of it is fixed in the national memory, and it is fixed accurately. A child in a coat in September in the warmth, because the instructions said to wear the coat rather than carry it. A luggage label tied to a buttonhole with the name and the school on it. A gas mask box on a string. A small case or a pillowcase or a paper carrier bag containing whatever the list had said to bring. A change of underclothes, a nightdress or pajamas, plimsolls, a comb, a toothbrush, a handkerchief, and a packet of sandwiches for the journey which was almost always eaten before the train had cleared the suburbs, because children have never in the history of the world successfully kept a packet of sandwiches for later. They went to Devon and Somerset and Wales and Norfolk and the Yorkshire Dales, to villages where the reception committee met the train with lists and clipboards and a very approximate idea of how many were coming. The billeting itself was often done in a village hall, in a manner that everybody involved afterwards agreed was less than ideal, with local householders choosing from the children in front of them. 10 shillings and 6 a week was paid for the first child taken in, and 8 and 6 for each one after that, and the money mattered in a good many houses. What happened next was one of the great collisions of the century, and it happened quietly, in kitchens and sculleries, without a single shot fired. 2 Britons that had been living in the same country without ever really looking at each other were put in the same room and told to get on with it. Children from the back streets of Liverpool and Glasgow and the East End arrived in comfortable homes in the shires. Farm laborers' cottages with an earth closet at the bottom of the garden took in the sons of clerks. There were households genuinely appalled by children who had never slept in a bed of their own, or seen a cow, or eaten a whole egg. There were children genuinely bewildered by houses with a room nobody sat in, and by silence at meals, and by the sheer alarming quantity of darkness and mud in the countryside at night. Some of those matches were miserable, and the misery of them is well recorded. And some of them lasted a lifetime. There are people who kept sending Christmas cards to a Somerset farmhouse for 50 years afterwards, and people who went back to be married in a village they had first seen from the window of a train at the age of 8. The whole thing acted, in the long run, like a very large spoon in a very settled pot. And a good deal of what Britain decided to do about housing and health and schooling after the war can be traced back to the fact that in September 1939, a great many comfortable people were shown, at close range and in their own front rooms, exactly how the other half was living. And then, having emptied the cities, the country sat down and waited for the bombers. And the bombers did not come. That is the strangest chapter of all, the winter of 1939 into 1940, which people at the time called the Boer War, and history has settled on calling the Phony War. War had been declared. The blackout was total. The balloons were up. The wardens were out. The sandbags were stacked 8 deep around every public building. And the shop windows were crisscrossed with brown paper tape against blast, and the theaters and cinemas had been ordered shut on the first day as a precaution against mass casualties. And nothing happened. The theaters reopened within a fortnight, because a nation that has been told to expect annihilation and instead gets a wet Tuesday will start asking about the cinema. The great fear did not arrive. Instead, there was rain and cold and one of the hardest winters in decades, with the Thames freezing at Kingston and ice on the inside of bedroom windows, and the blackout making the whole thing feel twice as long. Rationing began in January, quietly, with bacon and butter and sugar, and expanded through the spring to meat and then to tea. And the ration book. That small buff-colored pamphlet of numbered coupons settled into the nation's handbags and coat pockets for the next 14 years. And the children came home. They came home almost immediately, and it kept coming. By the middle of that first winter, something like half of all the evacuated children were back in the cities, brought home by mothers who could not bear it, or who could not afford the fares to visit, or who had simply looked at the situation and concluded, quite reasonably on the evidence available, that the whole thing had been a false alarm. By the spring of 1940, the reception areas were emptying out, and the schools in London were reopening because the pupils had reappeared, and the government was quietly producing posters begging mothers not to bring their children back, which is a difficult message to sell to a woman standing in a Devon village in the rain holding a return ticket. So when the sky finally did open in the late summer of 1940, a very large number of the children who had been so carefully carried out of the cities the previous September were back in exactly the streets they had left. The Phony War ended in April and May of 1940, and it ended the way a held breath ends. Denmark and Norway went in April. The Low Countries went in May. France, which the entire British strategic position had rested on, took 6 weeks. In the last days of May and the first days of June, the army came home off the beaches at Dunkirk in destroyers and paddle steamers and pleasure boats and Thames barges, and arrived at the South Coast railway stations in their tens of thousands, unshaven and salt-stained. To be handed tea and buns by women's voluntary service ladies who had set up urns on the platforms and did not stop pouring for a week. And then, quite suddenly, Britain looked at a map and discovered that the enemy was now standing on the far side of a strip of water 21 miles wide, with airfields all along the coast of northern France, in the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy and Brittany, close enough that a bomber could take off after lunch and be over London within the hour. Everything that had been a theory for 20 years became a matter of geography over the course of about a fortnight. The summer that followed was the one that everybody knows, or half knows, from the newsreels, the Battle of Britain. Fought in the clean blue air over Kent and Sussex and the Channel through July and August and into the autumn, with vapor trails scribbling over the hop fields and people standing in their gardens, shading their eyes to watch. It has been told so many times and so loudly that it is easy to forget what it actually was in strategic terms, which was an attempt to destroy the Royal Air Force so that an invasion fleet could cross the Channel without being sunk. The fighting was over convoys first, then over the coastal radar stations, then over the fighter airfields themselves. Through the last 2 weeks of August, that third phase came very close to succeeding. The airfields in Kent and Essex were being cratered faster than they could be filled in. Pilots were being lost faster than they could be trained. And then, at the very end of August, the whole shape of the war changed because of what appears to have been a navigational error. On a night in the last week of August, 1940, a small number of bombers looking for oil installations and factories on the eastern edge of London drifted off course in the dark and released their loads over the city itself. Bombs fell on the East End and in the city, and people were killed in their houses. Whether it was a mistake or not has been argued about ever since, but the response was immediate within a day or two. The Royal Air Force sent bombers to Berlin and did it again and again over the following week, and the political consequence of that in Germany was a decision to turn the whole weight of the air fleets away from the airfields and onto the British cities. For the fighter squadrons of southern England, exhausted and thinning out. That decision was a reprieve so complete that it very likely decided the outcome of the summer. For London, it meant the 7th of September. So we come back to the warm Saturday evening we started with, and the open front doors and the marrows on the shelter roofs. The afternoon had been beautiful. That is in every account. It was one of those blue September days with a high sun and a light haze, and a great many people had gone out into it, to Kent for the hop picking, to the parks, to football, to the seaside on cheap returns, or simply out into the garden to sit. The tide in the Thames was near the top of the flood. In the docks, the cranes stood still because it was the weekend, and the warehouses along both banks were full to the roof with the things that a world empire brings home, and stores by the river, raw sugar, rum, timber, grain, paint, rubber, tea, tallow, pepper, and several million pounds worth of it stacked in wooden-floored buildings that had been designed in the 1830s by men who were thinking mainly about rats. In the middle of the afternoon, the radar stations on the coast began reporting a formation building over the French shore, and then another behind it, and then another behind that, and the plotters at the fighter stations watched something assemble that nobody had seen before. Not a raid, but a mass, nearly 1,000 aircraft. Bombers stacked in layers with fighters above them, filling the sky from about 14,000 feet up to 26,000, on a front 20 miles wide, coming in over the Thames estuary. The fighter squadrons went up to meet it where they had been meeting everything all summer, over the airfields, because that was where the raids had been going. This one went past them and kept going, straight up the river. The first bombs fell on the docks a little before 5 in the afternoon, in daylight, with people out in the streets. Woolwich Arsenal was hit. The Royal Docks were hit. Silvertown, which is a narrow tongue of land with the river on one side and the dock basins on the other, and terraced streets packed in between the factories, was hit from end to end. The Surrey commercial docks on the south bank, acres upon acres of stacked imported timber standing in the open air, caught fire and then went up as a single enormous unit, and burned so fiercely that the fire crews could not get within 100 yards of the stacks and had to fight it from the water. By the time the light began to go, the whole eastward horizon of London was a wall of orange, and the smoke was going up in a column that people could see from the North Downs and from ships in the estuary and from the coast of France. And then, at about 8 in the evening, with the fires burning bright enough to read a newspaper by, the second wave arrived. And it did not need to navigate at all, because the target had been lit for it by the first. They came over in relays until 4:30 the following morning. In the streets around the docks, the raid was not a series of explosions, but a single continuous condition that went on for 8 hours. The drone of engines going over and coming back, the flat crack of the anti-aircraft guns, the falling whistle, the deep double thud that you felt through the pavement more than heard, the tinkle of glass afterwards, which is the sound everybody who lived through it mentions, and under all of it, the enormous soft roar of the timber yards. Something like 430 people were killed in London that night, and roughly 1,600 were badly hurt. And the East End boroughs of West Ham and Poplar and Stepney and Bermondsey lost whole streets. When the all clear went at dawn and people came up out of their shelters, the light was orange and strange because of the smoke, and there was a fine gray fall of ash coming down over Kent, and the water in the docks had burning oil on it. And the sugar from the refineries had run out molten across the roads and set solid, so that in some streets the surface was glazed with caramel that stuck to the boots of the rescue parties. It is the largest single event in the whole story, and I want to be careful with it, because we are not here to dwell in it. So let me tell you the ordinary things instead, the things that happened in the days immediately afterwards, because the ordinary things are the real subject of tonight. The first was that the arrangements did not work. This is worth saying clearly, because the story that got told afterwards, at the time, and for decades after, was a story of calm and order, and the calm was real, but the order took about a fortnight to arrive. The rest centers for the bombed out had been designed on the assumption that people would need shelter for a night. Instead, thousands of families arrived at a church hall or a school with nothing but the clothes they stood in and stayed for a week, sleeping on the floor, waiting for a billet that did not exist because the borough had no houses left to put them in. The first few nights, in some places, there was no proper food and no bedding, and one lavatory for 200 people, and it was the voluntary organizations, more than anybody, who filled the gap with soup and blankets and tea until the official system caught up. There is a much-repeated story about a school in West Ham where several hundred people who had been bombed out of Canning Town were gathered to wait for the coaches that would take them out of London, and the coaches were sent to the wrong place twice and did not come, and on the third night the school itself was hit. The number who died there was never settled. It was somewhere between the official figure and the very much larger figure that local people always insisted on, and the discrepancy became one of the small permanent sores of the East End for the rest of the century. Whatever the true number, the effect on policy was immediate. Within days, the whole apparatus of moving people out of a bombed area was rebuilt from scratch. The second ordinary thing was that people moved themselves. From the second night onwards, there was a nightly trek out of the worst boroughs, on foot, by bus, by anything, out to the parks on the edge of the city, to Epping Forest, to the fields, to any place with a hedge and no docks in it. In Kent, the hop pickers' huts filled up with East End families who had come down for the picking and simply stayed. Under the arches of the railway viaducts, in the goods tunnels, in the crypts of churches, people made a nightly camp and went back to work in the morning. It was called trekking, and the authorities disapproved of it for a while and then quietly organized it, which is the standard arc of official disapproval in this country. And the third ordinary thing, the one that mattered most, was that on Monday morning, people went to work. Not all of them, and not on time, and not to the same buildings, but the buses ran, more or less, on diverted routes past the roped-off streets. The underground ran. The docks that could work worked. Men who had spent the night in a shelter came up, washed at a standpipe in the road because the mains were cut, ate whatever there was, and walked to a job. Shops with no windows put up boards with white paint on them saying that they were open as usual, and the ones with a sense of humor said that they were more open than usual. Milk was delivered. Post was delivered. And the post office, which had a very good war, developed an entire system for chasing bombed-out households from address to address so that letters kept arriving. That is the pattern that established itself in the first week, and it held, with variations, for the next 8 months. The night belonged to the raid, and the morning belonged to the sweeping up. And the day belonged to work, and then the light went, and it all began again. And it did begin again. That same Sunday night, and a night after that, and a night after that. 57 nights, one after another, without a single break. From the 7th of September to the 2nd of November, 1940, London was bombed every single night. 57 consecutive nights with no evening off, in a run that only ended because of weather so thick that nothing could fly. And what happens to human beings when a thing like that repeats itself night after night is the most interesting part of the whole story, and it is not what the planners had predicted at all. It became a routine. The planners had expected hysteria and mass flight and a collapse of morale requiring police and possibly troops. What they got instead was a country that took an extraordinary situation, examined it for about a week, and then folded it into the timetable of ordinary life with a sort of exasperated competence. The way you might accommodate a leaking roof, you have been told, cannot be mended until spring. Let me take you through the shape of an evening, because the shape is the thing. And it is a very calming shape once it settles. Tea would be about 6. In the autumn of 1940, the light was going by 7 and gone by 8, and the blackout curtains went up before the lamp went on, and there was usually a small domestic drama about a chink of light showing at the corner and somebody outside in the street being very clear about it. Then the wireless and the news, which everybody listened to and nobody entirely believed, and then the plates washed, and then the question that every household in London was asking itself between about 7:30 and 8:30, which was whether to go down early or wait and see. Waiting and seeing had its supporters. There were people who never once went into a shelter for the whole 8 months, who stayed in their own bed and pulled the covers up and formed the private view that if it had their name on it, there was nothing to be done. A philosophy that is very hard to argue with and rather difficult to recommend. There were people who went under the stairs, that little triangular cupboard being the strongest part of a Victorian terraced house, and who sat there among the brooms and the meter with a cushion and a torch. And there were people who took the whole thing seriously and went down before dark with a flask. The sirens usually went between 8 and 9. The sound of them is the single most remembered noise of the period. A two-tone rising and falling wail produced by electric motors mounted on the roofs of police stations and factories and town halls, overlapping across the city in a slightly out-of-time chorus so that you could hear the near ones and the far ones and the very far ones layering behind each other. People called it Moaning Mini. Children learned to sleep straight through it. Dogs learned to head for the shelter before it started, having worked out, somewhere in the dog part of the brain, what the electric motors sounded like when they were spinning up. Then the going down. Down the garden path in the dark with the torch pointed at your feet, over the wet grass, to the little steel arch under its mound of earth, or along the street to the brick surface shelter on the corner, or, in an enormous number of cases, on a bus or a walk to the underground with a blanket over the arm and a cushion under it and a bag of sandwiches and a thermos at 6:30 in the evening to book a place. Inside a garden shelter, the sound of a raid arrives filtered. That is one of the things people remembered with something close to affection afterwards. Under 15 inches of earth, the sharp edges come off everything. The guns become a distant thumping, the aircraft become a rising and falling drone, and the near misses become a shudder in the ground and a rattle of soil coming down the back of your collar. There is a smell of paraffin from the lamp and damp earth and wet wool, and if somebody has been sensible, tea, there is condensation on the steel. There is somebody's foot in somebody's back. And there is, for hour after hour, absolutely nothing to do. So people did what people do. They knitted. They played cards and taught the children to play cards. And there is a generation of Londoners who learned cribbage in a hole in the ground. They read badly by torchlight. They talked in the low, rambling, unhurried way that people talk at 2 a.m. when there is nowhere to go, and the talk went in every direction and settled nothing. And an astonishing number of them slept, which the doctors of the time found genuinely surprising, and which anybody who has ever been very tired will find entirely predictable. Above them, the raid had its own pattern, and it was not, contrary to the newsreels, a continuous rain of bombs. It was a long procession. Aircraft came over in a stream, singly and in small groups, spread through the whole night, because a raid that lasted from 9 in the evening until 5 in the morning kept the whole city awake far more effectively than a concentrated attack of 1 hour. There would be a period of engine noise, then the guns, then perhaps something falling somewhere over towards the river. Then 20 minutes of nothing but the distant clanging bells of fire engines going somewhere, then another engine note growing. The guns are worth a word of their own. The anti-aircraft batteries in the parks and on the commons were, in the strict accounting, not very effective at hitting anything. In the first week, they were also very quiet, because the gunners were being told to hold fire so that the night fighters could work. And the effect on the public was immediate and negative. People took the silence of the guns to mean that nobody was doing anything at all. So in the second week, the order was reversed, and every gun in London was told to fire at anything, more or less continuously, whether or not there was a plausible target. The result was a colossal, ragged, rolling barrage that lit the sky over the parks and kept the whole city rattling, and did very little damage to the bombers and did an enormous amount for morale. Because it is much easier to lie in a damp hole listening to your own side making a noise than to lie in a damp hole in silence. It also brought down a rain of spent shell fragments on the streets, so that walking about during a raid without a steel helmet became a genuinely poor idea, and the collecting of shrapnel became the great schoolboy hobby of the war. Conducted at first light every morning, with rules and hierarchies and trading values that were understood by every child in Britain and no adult anywhere. And then, at some point between 4 and 6, the all clear. One long, steady, unwavering note holding on and on without the rise and fall, which everybody agreed was the most beautiful sound in the world, and which meant you could come up. Coming up is the part I find hardest to describe and easiest to picture. Cold gray morning, dew on the grass and on the shelter mound, a smell of burning that has become so normal that people stop noticing it after the first fortnight, brick dust and wet plaster and charred timber and sometimes gas from a broken main. The street and the question of the street, whether it is the same street. In the great majority of cases it was. That is the thing that gets lost. Night after night, most people came up and found their own house standing, their own front door, their own kettle, and a broken window at worst, and they swept up the glass and had breakfast and went to work. Sometimes they came up and found a gap. A house in the terrace gone, with the 2 neighbors standing open on either side, wallpaper on the exposed party walls, a fireplace hanging in mid-air on the 2nd floor with the mantelpiece still on it, and a staircase going up to nothing. That image, the exposed inside of a house, is the true visual signature of the whole period, more than any fire or any searchlight. The shocking domestic intimacy of a bedroom wall with roses on it, standing open to the road 4 stories up, and in front of the gap, from very early in the morning, the rescue parties, working slowly and quietly and with enormous care, calling for silence every few minutes so that they could listen. There is a question hanging over all of this that I have not answered yet, and it is one of the quietest and cleverest parts of the whole story, so let us take it slowly, because it is exactly the sort of thing to fall asleep to. How did they find anything? Consider the problem honestly. A bomber crew takes off from an airfield near Amiens at dusk. There is total blackout over the whole of England and total blackout over most of France as well. There is usually cloud. There is no landmark below them of any kind after the coast, because the coast, the rivers, the towns, and the railways have all disappeared into an undifferentiated black. They are navigating by compass and clock and a rough allowance for wind, which is a method that will put you within perhaps 10 or 15 miles of a target after 2 hours in the air. And 10 miles is the difference between a factory and a field full of sheep. The answer, in the autumn of 1940, was radio, and the systems involved were genuinely ingenious. The first was a pair of narrow radio beams transmitted from stations on the coast of occupied Europe. One beam was laid straight along the line the aircraft was to fly, and it was constructed so that if you drifted a fraction to the left, you heard a stream of dots in your headphones, and if you drifted to the right, you heard dashes, and if you were exactly on the line, the dots and the dashes overlapped into one continuous steady note. You simply flew the note. And a second beam was aimed to cross the first one directly over the target, so that when the crossing signal came through the headphones, you released the load and turned for home, and you never had to see anything at all. It was elegant, it worked, and the British discovered it, which is the good part. A young scientist working in intelligence assembled the case out of scraps, a note in a prisoner's interrogation, a fragment of a wireless log, a piece of captured equipment with a receiver more sensitive than it needed to be for ordinary blind landing. He argued against a good deal of skepticism from people who insisted such a beam could not be made to bend far enough around the curve of the earth, that the beams existed and were being laid across England every night. An aircraft was sent up to look for them and found nothing on the first flight, and then, on a June evening in 1940, found the note and the dots and the dashes exactly where the theory said they should be. And once you know a beam is there, you can do things to it. What followed was a long, patient, invisible contest that went on all through the bombing, conducted by a handful of people in requisitioned country houses and by radio units in lorries parked in fields. They jammed the beams. They found ways to reproduce the dashes at the wrong moment so that a crew flying carefully down the study note would be nudged imperceptibly a degree or two off. They rebroadcast the crossing signal early so that the release point arrived while the aircraft was still short of the city. None of it was dramatic. Nobody watching from the ground would have seen anything at all. But on a good night, a bomber stream could be walked several miles off its track and persuaded to unload into open country. And on the best nights, the loot fell on plowland and hedges, and nobody in the target city ever knew that anything had been done for them. The other half of the deception was even better, because the other half involved building fake towns. If the enemy is guided partly by fire, and the fires of the first wave light the target for the second, then a very obvious idea presents itself, and Britain pursued it with enthusiasm. Out in the countryside, some miles from the real cities, on heath and moor and marsh, the authorities built decoy sites, arrangements of dim lights laid out in the pattern of a blacked-out town seen imperfectly from the air, with a railway marshalling yard and a factory and a scatter of badly managed street lighting. They were operated from a concrete bunker by two men with a switchboard. And the best of them could catch fire on demand. Along the ground lay racks and troughs and baskets of timber and creosote and coal, fed with oil, arranged so that at the flick of a switch a great sprawling blaze could be started that from 12,000 feet in the dark looked exactly like a city that had just been hit and was burning nicely. There were versions with flashes to imitate incendiaries falling, and versions with sudden bursts to imitate exploding mains, all fired in sequence by the two men in the bunker, who would then have the interesting experience of watching a bombing raid arrive on their creation from 100 yards away. Several hundred of these sites were built across Britain, guarding the big cities and the ports and the aircraft factories. They took a genuinely useful number of bombs. Some nights they took almost everything, and a raid that had been aimed at a city center went instead into a wet field with a burning stack of firewood in the middle of it, and in the morning the crater count would be reported, and the timber restacked, and the site made ready again for the following night. And above the cities themselves there were the balloons, which everybody remembers and almost nobody understands. A barrage balloon is not there to stop anything hitting it. It is a fat silver gas bag with 3 fins, some 60 feet long, flown at a few thousand feet on a steel cable, and the cable is the weapon. A whole barrage of them over a city puts up a forest of steel wires that an aircraft cannot fly through. And the effect of that is not to bring bombers down, though it occasionally did, but to force them to stay above the balloon ceiling. And an aircraft forced to stay above a certain height is an aircraft that cannot dive bomb, cannot aim precisely, and is sitting exactly where the anti-aircraft guns are expecting it. They were flown by crews who lived on the site, often women in the later years. And looking after one was heavy, wet, physical work, involving winches and sandbags and a large quantity of mud, and the balloons themselves were temperamental in wind and had an alarming enthusiasm for attracting lightning. In a good gale, a number would break their cables and go wandering off across the country, trailing steel wire through telephone lines, which is a hazard that no peacetime planner had ever had to write a procedure for, and which they very quickly did. And on the ground beneath all of it were the searchlights, in belts across the approaches, sweeping and pausing and sweeping. And their beams over a city at night were, by universal agreement, beautiful. They crossed and recrossed against the cloud base, and lit the undersides of the balloons silver, and when they caught something, the whole sky seemed to tighten around one small, bright moving speck, with 3 or 4 beams locked onto it and following. That is the picture I would like to leave you with for this part of the night, not the fires, but the geometry above them. Beams of radio going out invisibly from the French coast and being quietly bent by men in a lorry in a field in Worcestershire. Fake burning towns on the heath tended by 2 men with a switchboard. Silver whales riding on wires over the rooftops. And the searchlights turning slowly back and forth across a cloud ceiling all night, like the beams of very patient lighthouses looking for something they mostly did not find. Now, the shelters, because there's a whole small civilization in them and it deserves its own hour. The steel arch in the garden covered a great many people, but not everybody had a garden. In the inner boroughs, in the streets of flats, in the tenement blocks, in the back-to-backs, there was nowhere to dig. And for those households, the answer was the surface shelter, a plain rectangular box of brick with a reinforced concrete slab on top, built along the middle of the street or across the end of it, or on any handy patch of waste ground, holding 50 people on wooden benches. They were not loved. Some of the early ones had been built in a hurry by contractors working to a specification that had been misprinted or misread regarding the strength of the mortar, and a small number of them behaved very badly indeed under blast, in a way that was rapidly corrected but never forgotten. They were also dark, and they smelled, and they were used as public conveniences by passers-by in a manner that the borough surveyors described in the driest possible language in their annual reports. People preferred, on the whole, almost anything else. What people actually wanted was to go deep, and under London there was somewhere deep, and everybody knew it. The government's position on the underground at the start was no. It was a firm no, and it had reasons, and the reasons were not stupid. If people slept in the tube stations, the trains could not run properly, and the workers could not get to work. If a station were hit, the casualties in a packed platform would be very high. If people went underground and found it comfortable, they might develop what the planning documents actually called a deep shelter mentality, and simply refuse to come back up, and the war effort would grind to a halt. Posters went up, station staff were instructed, the gates were manned. And the people of London solved it elegantly in about a week by buying a ticket. You could not be refused entry to a station if you had paid your fare. So families arrived at Liverpool Street and Holborn and Elephant and Castle in the late afternoon with blankets and a bag, bought the cheapest ticket available, went down the escalator, walked to the far end of the platform, sat down against the wall, and stayed. There was nothing anybody could do about it that did not involve police dragging women and children up escalators, which nobody was prepared to do and which would have looked spectacular in the newspapers. Within a fortnight, the policy had been reversed, and within a month, the official position was that the underground was a shelter and always had been. delivered with the perfectly straight face that British administration reserves for a total change of mind. At its peak, in late September 1940, about 177,000 people slept in the underground on a single night. That was never more than a small fraction of London, and this is worth saying because the tube dominates the picture so completely that people assume everybody was down there. In fact, at the height of the bombing, roughly 6 in every 10 Londoners spent the night in their own homes, and only about 1 in 25 was in the underground. But that 1 in 25 made the photographs, and the photographs made the memory, and the memory is not wrong about the atmosphere, even if it is wrong about the numbers. Because what grew on those platforms in the autumn and winter of 1940 was a whole society, with its own customs, its own local government, its own newspapers, and its own quarrels about where the line of blankets should be drawn. At first, it was chaos, people lying anywhere. The space between the platform edge and the wall claimed by whoever got there first. No water beyond the fire buckets, no lavatories at all beyond a bucket behind a curtain at the end of the platform, and a smell that everybody who wrote about it struggled to describe politely, and mostly settled on describing as warm. Ticket queues formed in the middle of the afternoon. Places were reserved by leaving a rolled blanket, and the etiquette of the rolled blanket was enforced with a rigor that no law could have matched. Then, over the winter, the organization arrived. Bunks were installed 3 tiers high along the platform walls, some 70,000 of them across the system, and a ticketing system gave families a numbered bunk they could count on so that the afternoon queue disappeared. Chemical closets were installed, water was piped in, shelter marshals were appointed, many of them elected by the shelterers themselves, and they enforced quiet hours and settled disputes and organized the sweeping. Medical aid posts were set up, staffed by nurses, and the incidence of infectious disease, which the doctors had confidently expected to be catastrophic in such conditions, turned out to be remarkably low, which nobody has ever entirely explained and which the doctors of the time found faintly annoying. Special trains ran through the tunnels after the current was cut, carrying tea and cocoa and buns and meat pies, stopping at each platform, and the arrival of the refreshment train became the fixed social event of the night. Libraries appeared, run off a trolley. Evening classes appeared. There were shelter concerts and shelter dances at the ends of platforms, and shelter nativity plays at Christmas, and in one station a gramophone club, and in another a debating society that met twice a week and appears from the surviving minutes to have argued mainly about the debating society. Not all the deep shelters were stations. There were the great goods tunnels and the disused sections of line. There was an unfinished stretch of tunnel at Bethnal Green with no track in it at all, which the borough fitted out with bunks for several thousand and a library and a theater. There was a warehouse basement at Tilbury and Stepney, an enormous vaulted goods cellar that at times held more than 10,000 people in conditions that appalled every official who ever inspected it, and which people went to anyway, night after night, because it was deep and it was warm and everybody they knew was there. And in the spring of 1941, the government began digging a set of proper deep shelters, purpose-built, more than 100 feet down beneath a string of underground stations, each one a pair of parallel tunnels a quarter of a mile long, fitted with bunks for 8,000. They were an enormous undertaking, and they were a fine piece of engineering. And by the time they were ready, the heavy bombing of London had stopped, so most of them spent the middle of the war as government offices and stores, which is a very home front sort of ending. The last shelter of the set arrived in March 1941, and it is my favorite object of the entire war. It was designed for households with no garden and no cellar and no wish to go out into the street at all, and it was essentially a table. A steel plate on top, a wire mesh cage underneath, 4 stout legs, delivered flat in 359 pieces with a spanner. You put it in the back room, you ate your dinner on it during the day. And at night, the family got underneath it and went to sleep. It was named after the minister responsible, and it was free to lower-income households, and about 500,000 of them were made. The point of it was blunt, and it worked. If a house came down, the thing that killed people was the floor above landing on them. The table did not have to hold up a building. It had to hold up one collapsed ceiling for a few hours until somebody dug you out, and it did that reliably enough that the surveys afterwards found a strikingly high survival rate among people who had been under 1 in a house that had been demolished around them. There is something wonderfully domestic about it. The last line of defense against the largest air force in the world was a very sturdy dining table with a cloth on it and a vase of dried flowers in the middle. Above ground, while all that was going on beneath the pavement, there was a second organization working through the night, and it was made almost entirely of ordinary people who had signed a form. The warden is the figure at the center of it. There were something like 400,000 of them by the height of the bombing, about 1 in 6 of them women, and the great majority part-time volunteers who did 2 or 3 nights a week on top of a full day's work. A warden's post was a small brick blockhouse or a converted shop or somebody's front basement with a telephone. A map of the sector pinned to the wall with every house on it, a stack of message forms, a kettle, a stirrup pump, and a stove. A warden's sector was about 6 streets, and the essential qualification for the job was knowing them. Not knowing the street names, knowing the streets, which house had the old man on the top floor who could not manage the stairs quickly, which one had the new baby, which family had gone to the country and left the place empty, which basement was flooded, where the water stopcock was, where the gas main ran, which cellar connected through to next door. When a building came down in the dark, the single most valuable object in the borough was a person who could stand in the road and say with confidence how many people had been in that house at 11 o'clock and where in it they slept. The rest of the job was frankly unglamorous, and the wardens took a certain amount of public teasing for it in the first year, when there was not much bombing and a great deal of enforcement. They were the ones who knocked on the door about the light showing at the landing window. They were the ones who checked that the stirrup pump was in working order and that the sand bucket was not full of cigarette ends and that the householder had actually read the leaflet about incendiaries instead of using it to line a drawer. The music hall comedians did very well out of the warden for about 18 months and then stopped abruptly in September 1940 for reasons that require no explanation. Because from the 7th of September, the job changed entirely. When a bomb fell, the warden nearest to it walked toward it, in the dark, in a steel helmet and a boiler suit, and made an assessment. And got a message back to the post, what had been hit, how many buildings, whether there was fire, whether there was gas, whether the road was blocked, and roughly how many people were likely to be under it. Everything that came afterwards, every ambulance and every rescue lorry and every fire pump was dispatched on the strength of that message. A good warden's report got the right help to the right hole in the ground within minutes. A vague one wasted an hour. Then came the rescue parties, and I have a great deal of time for the rescue parties. They were by trade builders, demolition men, bricklayers, scaffolders, navvies, men who understood in their hands how a house is held up and therefore how it falls down. Heavy rescue worked in squads with a lorry full of timber and jacks and crowbars and ropes, and their work was slow, and it was quiet, and it was the exact opposite of everything the newsreels liked. They would arrive at a mound of broken brick and roof timber standing where 4 houses had been, and they would stop and look at it for a long time and work out from the shape of the collapse where the void spaces would be, and then start moving material by hand, one piece at a time, because a jerk on the wrong beam could bring the rest down onto whoever was underneath. Every so often, the foreman would call for silence, and the whole street would go quiet, the pumps would be throttled back, and 30 men would stand still on a pile of rubble in the dark and listen for tapping. That is the sound at the center of the whole 8 months, and it is not a bomb. It is 30 people standing perfectly still, listening. They got people out from under collapsed buildings after 12 hours, and after 2 days, and in a few celebrated cases after most of a week. They tunneled in on their stomachs through gaps a foot high, shoring as they went with short lengths of timber, and a doctor would sometimes crawl in behind them to get a drip into somebody's arm in a space where nobody could kneel upright. And when it was finished, they went and had a cup of tea, and then went to the next one, and their names are almost entirely unrecorded. Then the fire service, which was the largest of all the civil defense organizations and had the worst nights. Before the war, firefighting in Britain was a local matter, and it was a shambles. There were more than 1,000 separate brigades, run by boroughs and urban districts with different equipment, different ranks, different training, and most spectacularly, different hydrant couplings, so that a pump sent from one town to help its neighbor could quite easily arrive at the fire and find that its hoses did not fit. The auxiliary fire service was created before the war to bulk out the regulars, and by 1940 it was enormous. Tens of thousands of part-time volunteers, taxi drivers towing trailer pumps behind their own cabs, women driving the tenders and staffing the control rooms, and a training program that in some places consisted of 1 weekend and a leaflet. They learned the hard way, and they learned very fast, and in August 1941, the whole thing was nationalized into a single National Fire Service with 1 rank structure, 1 training standard, and, at long last, 1 size of hydrant coupling, which is the sort of dull reform that saves more lives than any amount of heroism. The work itself was a matter of water, and water was the permanent problem. High explosive broke the mains so that a crew could couple up to a hydrant in a burning street and get nothing but a trickle of brown. The answer was to go to the river or to build enormous static water tanks, and for the rest of the war London was dotted with them, steel and concrete basins on bombed sites, holding thousands of gallons, with a sign on the side and, inevitably, a small population of goldfish that somebody had put in and nobody had authorized. Fireboats worked from the Thames. Relay pumping was developed, where a chain of pumps carried water half a mile from the river up through the streets, 1 pump feeding the next, and the whole line depending on nobody in the middle running out of petrol. And then there was the incendiary bomb, which is the true villain of the story, and which was small. That is the thing that surprises people. The device that burned out the center of half the cities of Britain was about 2 feet long, weighed a couple of pounds, and could be carried in 1 hand. It was mostly magnesium alloy, with a small charge to ignite it, and a bomber could carry hundreds. They fell in showers, clattering onto roofs and pavements and through skylights, and each one burned white hot for about 10 minutes, and a single one landing in a roof void full of dry Victorian timber and a century of dust would take a building. But a single one, caught in the first 2 minutes, could be dealt with by one person with a bucket of sand, or a long-handled scoop, or a stirrup pump and 2 buckets of water, one to pump from and one to refill. That was the whole civil defense doctrine in a sentence. Get to it early, and it is nothing. Leave it 10 minutes, and it is a street. Which is why the entire country was drilled endlessly in the use of a hand pump that a strong child could work. And why the roofs of Britain filled up night after night with quiet people sitting in deck chairs among the chimney pots with a bucket beside them, waiting. There were other services, smaller and stranger, and they should have their minute too. There were the ambulance crews, a great many of them women, driving converted vans and requisitioned laundry lorries through streets with no lights and no signposts, over hoses and around craters, navigating by memory. There were the first aid posts set up in school halls and swimming baths, where the walking wounded came in all night with glass in their arms and dust in their eyes, and where a very large proportion of the work turned out to be tea, sweet and strong, because the single most common condition after a nearby explosion is not injury, but shock. And the standard treatment for it in 1940 was a blanket, a chair, and a hot drink, which remains, in essence, the standard treatment now. There were the men and women of the messenger service, mostly teenagers of 17 and 18 who were too young to be called up, riding bicycles between the warden's posts and the control centers through the middle of a raid, carrying paper messages because the telephone lines were down. They wore steel helmets a size too big and were, by every account, entirely fearless in the way that only the very young are, and their bicycles were the last reliable communication network in a great many boroughs. And there were the bomb disposal parties, whose work I will describe only briefly and then leave, because their line of business does not belong in a bedtime story. A significant proportion of the bombs that fell did not go off when they landed. Some were faulty. Some had delayed action fuses of 1 hour or 12 or 72 set deliberately so that a street could not be reopened, or a railway line repaired, or a factory restarted, until somebody had gone down into the hole and dealt with it. An unexploded bomb closed everything around it. It stopped the trains, emptied the houses, and shut the factory, and every hour it sat there was an hour of production lost. So the pressure on the disposal squads to work quickly was constant and enormous. They were mostly Royal Engineers, and they dug. That is the part that is always left out. The overwhelming majority of the job was digging, by hand, with a shovel, down 20 or 30 feet through clay and rubble and sewage, shoring the sides as they went, following the entry hole for hours to reach a cylinder that might be perfectly inert and might not. And then a small number of men went down the shaft with a set of tools and a great deal of accumulated knowledge, and did something careful, and then came up, and the street was reopened, and the greengrocer put his trestles back out on the pavement. Now let me take you back above ground, into the daylight, because the day had its own texture and it was not all sweeping up. The organization that met people at the worst moment of their lives was, more often than not, the Women's Voluntary Service, and its arrival in this story is one of the quiet triumphs of the whole period. It had been formed a couple of years before the war to help with air raid precautions, and it grew to something like 1 million members, and it had no rank structure worth speaking of. A uniform in a color officially described as gray-green with a red-brown jumper, and an operating philosophy that consisted of turning up before anybody had asked and doing whatever was obviously needed. Their mobile canteens are in every photograph of every bombed street in Britain, a converted van with a hatch in the side, a tea urn, trays of buns. And 2 or 3 women in that gray-green uniform pouring for 4 hours without a break. For the rescue parties, the firemen, the bombed-out families sitting on their own furniture in the road, and any passing person who looked as though a cup would help. They ran the rest centers once the rest centers had been properly organized, which is to say, from about the 3rd week of the bombing onwards, with blankets and camp beds and hot food and a table where you could begin the extremely long business of finding out where the rest of your family had gone. They also ran the clothing stores, which were stocked partly from the enormous quantities of clothing sent over from America and the Commonwealth by people who had read about the bombing in their own newspapers and gone through their own wardrobes. A family bombed out at midnight arrived at a church hall with nothing, and the WV's clothing store found them a coat, a pair of shoes in roughly the right size, and a change for the children, and did it without paperwork, which by the standards of 1940 was practically revolutionary. Feeding a bombed city turned out to be the great unglamorous problem of the whole business, and the solution to it changed the way Britain ate. If the gas is off, and the water is off, and the shops in your parade have no fronts, you cannot cook. Multiply that by a few thousand households in a borough, and you have a genuine emergency that has nothing to do with food supply and everything to do with kettles. The answer was communal feeding on a scale Britain had never attempted. Emergency kitchens, then Londoners' meal services, then. Spreading out across the country under a name suggested by the Prime Minister himself because the original title sounded too much like a soup kitchen, the British restaurants. There were more than 2,000 of them by the middle of the war. They were run by local authorities, usually in a school hall or a church hall or a hut on a bomb site. They were non-profit. And they served a plain, hot midday meal for around $1, soup, a meat and 2 vegetables, a pudding and a cup of tea, with no ration coupons required. Anybody could walk in. Factory workers ate in them, and clerks, and pensioners, and children, and people who had been bombed out the night before, at the same long tables with the same thick white plates. They were not, by all accounts, culinary landmarks. The vegetables were of the boiled school, but they were hot, and they were cheap, and they were dependable, and for a considerable number of poorer households, they were the most reliable source of a cooked meal that anybody in the family had ever had. Which is a slightly uncomfortable thing to notice about a country that had spent the previous century running an empire. And this is where I want to say something about the food generally, because rationing is one of those subjects that sounds like deprivation and was, in a complicated way, something else as well. Rationing had started in January 1940 with bacon, butter, and sugar, and by the end of the year it covered meat, tea, margarine, cooking fat, and cheese. And in 1941 it took in preserves and, at last, eggs. The weekly ration for one adult settled at something like 4 ounces of bacon, 8 ounces of sugar, 2 ounces of tea, 2 ounces of butter, an ounce or 2 of cheese, depending on the month, and $1 and something's worth of meat, which is not a weight, but a value. So the shrewder shopper bought cheaper cuts and got more of them. Then in December 1941 came the point system, which was the genuinely clever part. Tinned goods, dried fruit, biscuits, breakfast cereals, and pulses were not rationed by quantity, but by a monthly allowance of points that you could spend however you liked. And the ministry adjusted the points value of each item up and down according to what was in the warehouses. It let people choose, it let supply be managed, and it turned every housewife in Britain into an amateur commodities analyst, watching the announced values each month with the concentration of a stockbroker. What was never rationed was bread, potatoes, vegetables, and fish, in principle. Though fish was scarce because the trawler fleets had been requisitioned and queues for it were legendary, and nothing at all was rationed if you grew it, which is the whole reason for the campaign that turned the country's lawns and parks and railway embankments into vegetable plots. The number of allotments went up by more than half. The moat of the Tower of London grew cabbages. There were pigs in the yard behind a good many suburban houses kept by pig clubs of neighbors who pooled their kitchen scraps and, when the time came, shared the result under an arrangement with the ministry that was a masterpiece of tactful drafting. The nutritionists who studied all this afterwards came to a conclusion that has never quite been popular, that by the standards of the 1930s, when a large part of the population had been genuinely underfed, the wartime diet was better. Less sugar, less fat, less meat, far more vegetables, free milk and cod liver oil and orange juice for children and expectant mothers, and a national loaf made from a higher extraction flour that everybody complained about bitterly and which was considerably better for them than the white bread it replaced. Infant mortality fell during the war. It is an awkward, unromantic fact, and it sits there in the statistics, refusing to go away. Now let us talk about tiredness, because tiredness is the true condition of the whole 8 months, and it is almost never in the newsreels. Consider what the arithmetic of a raid actually does to a household. The sirens go at 9. You are in the shelter or under the table or under the stairs until 4 or 5 in the morning. You get perhaps 3 hours of thin, interrupted half-listening sleep, and probably less if you have a small child who has decided that the whole thing is fascinating. Then you get up and you go to work because the factory expects you and the money is needed and there is a war on, and you do a full shift, and you come home and you eat and the sirens go at 9. And you do that for 57 nights running, and then, after 1 night off for fog, you do it again for another 6 months at a slightly reduced rate. Everybody who studied the home front afterwards came to the same conclusion, which is that the great cost of the bombing to the ordinary population was not fear. Fear came and went, and mostly went, because human beings adapt to a repeated stimulus with a speed that would be depressing if it were not so useful. The great cost was sleep. Chronic, grinding, cumulative loss of sleep spread across a whole population for the better part of a year, expressing itself in short tempers and small mistakes and industrial accidents, and a general gray flatness that people described in their diaries as feeling stupid. The wartime social researchers who wandered about with notebooks recording what people actually said in queues and pubs found the subject of sleep came up more than any other, not the raids. Sleep, whether you had got any, where you might get some, whether it was worth going down early to get a decent place. Factories introduced restrooms and, in some cases, official permission to sleep at the bench during a lull. There were widespread and quite serious discussions about whether workers should be allowed to come in late after a bad night, and the answer generally was yes, quietly, without it being written down anywhere. And that, more than any speech, is what people mean when they talk about how the country got through it. Not defiance, endurance, which is a much duller thing and lasts much longer. The other half of getting through was entertainment, and the war was, unexpectedly, a golden age for it. The cinemas, closed for a fortnight, in September 1939, reopened and then boomed. By the middle of the war, something like 30 million cinema tickets were being sold every week in a country of 40-odd million people. They ran in the afternoons and early evenings, and they carried a small slide that the projectionist could put up mid-film to announce that an alert had sounded, with the information that the performance would continue and that anybody wishing to leave should do so quietly, and the recorded fact is that hardly anybody ever left. People sat through raids watching musicals on the entirely defensible ground that they were as safe there as anywhere, and the seats were better. The wireless became, in this period, the true hearth of the country. There were two programs, the Home Service and, from the beginning of 1940, the Forces program, and the news bulletins at 9 in the evening emptied the pubs. Comedy did extraordinary things. There was a half-hour show built around a chaotic government ministry, stuffed with catchphrases that spread through the whole country within a week of each broadcast, and which had an audience of something like 16 million, which is to say that on Thursday evenings, a third of the population of Britain was listening to the same jokes at the same moment. Music while you work went out twice a day into the factories, half an hour of steady, uninterrupted dance band with no announcements and a strict tempo, designed by people who had genuinely researched what rhythm keeps a production line moving. And it did. Dance halls stayed open and were full. Concerts were given at lunchtime in the National Gallery, which had sent its paintings to a slate mine in Wales and had a great deal of empty wall, and a pianist played there right through the bombing, and when the raids came, the audience moved down to a shelter room in the basement, and she went on playing. Theaters reopened. Football carried on in a reduced regional league with guest players who happened to be stationed nearby, and crowds capped for safety. Now, since we are being honest tonight, let me put in the thing that the wartime newsreels left out, because the story is better with it in, and it will not keep you awake. The picture of a country united and cheerful and endlessly making tea is not false, but it is smoothed. There was crime, and quite a lot of it. Looting from bombed premises became a serious enough problem that the court started handing down heavy sentences, and a proportion of the offenders were, awkwardly, members of the civil defense services who were the first people lawfully on the site. The black market was real and large, and everybody who could afford it used it a bit. There was friction, sharp and sometimes ugly, between the boroughs that were being flattened and the districts that were not, and in the first fortnight a group from the East End made their point by walking into the shelter of a very grand hotel in Piccadilly at the start of a raid and refusing to move, which was, in its way, a piece of political theater worthy of the best of them. There was rumor, endlessly. There was profound official anxiety about morale that produced a whole apparatus of secret reporting, because the government did not trust its own newspapers to tell it whether people were coping. And in the badly bombed provincial cities, where the raids came in 3 or 4 enormous blows rather than as a nightly routine, The effect on a smaller place with fewer resources was measurably worse than in London, and in one or two cases came genuinely close to the collapse that the planners had feared, before the emergency machinery caught up. The monarchy did rather well out of the period, and did so honestly. The king and queen stayed in London, which they were under no obligation to do, and went out to the bombed streets of the East End repeatedly, and were, in the first week, received with a certain amount of understandable coolness by people standing in front of their own wrecked houses. Then, in the middle of September, Buckingham Palace itself was hit while they were in it, twice, and the Queen said afterwards that she was glad, because it meant she could look the East End in the face. That single remark, which is one of the very few pieces of royal public relations in the century that appears to have been entirely spontaneous, changed the temperature of every subsequent visit. And there was the government, which had, by the autumn of 1940, become something quite unlike a peacetime administration. It had taken powers over labor, over property, over food, over what could be manufactured and by whom, of a completeness that no British government had ever held before, and it used them. Factories were converted by direction, workers were directed into industries, land was requisitioned by letter, iron railings were cut off the front walls of half the terraces in the country for scrap, in a scheme whose actual contribution to steel production was, it later turned out, close to negligible, but which had an enormous symbolic value and left a legacy of stumpy iron stubs in the top of garden walls that you can still find sawn off flat all over Britain. That is the machinery. Now let us go back out to the 57 nights, and then out of London altogether, because the bombing did not stay in the capital, and the winter of 1940 is when it went traveling. The 57 nights ended on the 2nd of November, 1940, and they ended because of fog. Not because of any decision, and not because of the defenses, but because the weather over northern France came down thick and wet and gray, and nothing could take off, and London slept. People remembered that night for the rest of their lives, and what they remembered was silence. A whole city lying in the dark with no engines in it. Some of them, according to more than one account, could not sleep, because after 8 weeks the body had learned to listen for something, and the absence of it was louder than the thing itself. The raids came back the following night, and they continued, but the pattern changed. From November onwards, London was hit heavily, but not nightly, and the weight of the attack began to spread out across the rest of Britain, because the enemy had come to the reasonable conclusion that a capital city is a simple but a manufacturing town is a bottleneck. The first of those, and the one whose name became a byword, was Coventry. Coventry in 1940 was a medium-sized Midland city with a very old center and a very modern economy. It had a cathedral, St. Michael's, a 15th-century parish church of extraordinary height and lightness with a slender spire, one of the tallest in England. It had streets of timber-framed medieval houses, genuinely medieval, leaning out over the pavements. And packed in among all that, sometimes on the same street, it had the machine shops and factories of the British motor industry, which by 1940 were making aero engines and gun barrels and aircraft components in enormous quantity. On the 14th of November, 1940, a clear night with a full moon, some 500 bombers came for it in a single concentrated attack that lasted 11 hours. The first wave dropped flares and incendiaries to light and mark the target, which was a technique being refined that autumn and which worked with terrible efficiency on a compact city center full of old timber. Then the high explosive came, deliberately including a very large number of parachute mines and delayed action bombs, and the water mains were broken early, and the telephone lines went, and the fire service found itself fighting a city-wide fire with no water and no communications. By the morning, something like 4,000 houses were gone and 3/4 of the factories were damaged. And about 568 people had been killed, which in a city of that size is a catastrophe of a different order to anything London had experienced in a single night. The cathedral burned. The volunteer watch on the roof had put out the first incendiaries, and then more came, and the lead melted, and the great medieval timber ceiling caught. And by dawn St. Michael's was a shell with its walls and tower standing, and open sky where the nave had been. And this is where the story turns, and turns in a way that has stayed with the place ever since. In the days afterwards, the cathedral's provost had 2 of the charred roof beams that had fallen into the ruins bound together into a cross and set it up on the altar rubble, and had the words, "Father, forgive," cut into the wall behind it. Not forgive them. Forgive it was, by any measure, an astonishing thing to do that week, and it has become the permanent identity of the city. The burned shell was deliberately left standing when the new cathedral was built beside it 20 years later, and the 2 of them stand together now. The ruin and the new building at right angles, joined by a great glass screen, so that when you sit in the new nave, you are looking straight out into the old one. Coventry was the first, but the winter that followed took the bombing all round the coast and up through the industrial country, city by city, and it is worth walking through it slowly, because the geography of it explains everything. Southampton, in the last week of November and the first week of December, twice, very heavily. A port city with its docks and its aircraft works, and the center burned so completely that for several nights afterwards, a large part of the population walked out into the New Forest at dusk and slept under the trees. Bristol, from November through the spring, 6 major attacks. The old heart of the city around Castle Street and Wine Street burned out and never rebuilt as it had been. Birmingham, hit repeatedly through the winter, the largest manufacturing center outside London, and the least reported at the time because the census kept its name out of the papers for a considerable while, so that the city read about attacks on a Midlands town and had to work out for itself that this meant them. Sheffield, in the middle of December, 2 nights, the Steel City, where a strange and lucky thing happened. The great heavy forging works out in the east end of the valley, which made the crankshafts for aero engines and were the only plant of their kind in the country, were largely missed, and the bombs fell instead on the shopping streets in the center. Manchester, over the 2 nights before Christmas, the warehouses of the old cotton trade burning along Piccadilly and Portland Street. Liverpool, which took more than any city outside London, because Liverpool was where the convoys came in, and if you could close the Mersey, you could starve the country. The docks and the streets behind them were bombed again and again through the winter, and then subjected in the first week of May 1940, 1 to 7 consecutive nights that came very close to closing the port entirely. Clydebank, on the Clyde outside Glasgow, in March 1941, 2 nights, and the figures there are the ones that stop you. A burg of some 12,000 houses, of which fewer than 10 came through undamaged, and a population of 50,000, of whom something like 40,000 were homeless by the end of the second night. They walked out into the hills and the surrounding towns, and the shipyards and the great engine works were repaired and went back to work within weeks, and the houses took years. Swansea, 3 nights in February, the town center gone. Plymouth, through March and April, 5 heavy nights that left the naval port working and the city around it destroyed. So completely that the population trekked out onto the moors every evening in their thousands. Belfast in April, which had almost no shelters and almost no anti-aircraft guns because it had been assumed to be out of range, and which lost around 1,000 people in a single night. The worst loss outside London. Hull, which was bombed more often than almost anywhere and reported less than anywhere because it was always described as a northeast town. Exeter, Norwich, Bath, York, Canterbury, Cardiff, Newcastle, Sunderland, Nottingham, Portsmouth. By the end of it, more than 60 towns and cities in Britain had been bombed, and the shape of a great many British town centers today. The reason a medieval street pattern suddenly gives way to a ring road and a shopping precinct built in the 1950s was decided in those 8 months. And in each of those places the same story played out in miniature, with the same lessons learned in the same order, the rest centers overwhelmed on the first night, the trekking out to the fields, the emergency water tanks, the mutual aid columns of fire engines driving in from 3 counties away, and the discovery, made again and again, that a smaller city has less slack in it than a capital, and needs help from outside within hours rather than days. There was a moment in the middle of that winter when the whole thing came very close to the collapse the planners had predicted. Not a collapse of will, exactly, a collapse of administration, nobody to sign for the blankets, no lists of who was missing, no plan for feeding 30,000 people whose kitchens had gone. And what stopped it was mostly the same thing everywhere, which was that a few hundred people in each town who had no authority whatsoever simply went ahead and organized it, and asked for permission afterwards. Meanwhile, back in London, on the Sunday after Christmas, the oldest part of the city burned. The 29th of December, 1940, is the night that produced the single most famous photograph of the whole war, and the circumstances of it were a set of small misfortunes arriving together in a way that no plan had allowed for. It was a Sunday evening. The city of London, the square mile of banks and offices and warehouses and printers, and the churches of Sir Christopher Wren, is a district where almost nobody lives. On a weekday it holds hundreds of thousands of people, and on a Sunday night in the Christmas week of 1940 it held caretakers and a few fire watchers and a great many locked doors. The tide in the Thames was at its lowest, so that the fireboats could not reach the water easily from the stairs, and the hose lines had to be run out a long way over the mud. And a water main was broken very early on, which took the pressure out of a large part of the district's hydrants. Into that came a raid that was almost entirely incendiary. Something over 20,000 of the little magnesium sticks came down in a few hours onto a square mile of locked buildings full of paper, and there was nobody inside to put them out. The fires joined. That is the phrase that appears in the reports, and it is the thing that everybody dreaded and rarely saw. Individual fires growing into each other until they became one fire with its own weather, pulling air in at the edges hard enough to lean on. Whole streets of Victorian warehouses in the book trade around Paternoster Row went, and something like 5 million books burned in a single night, which is a fact I have never been able to get comfortable with. 8 of Wren's churches were destroyed or gutted. The Guildhall lost its roof, and in the middle of it stood St. Paul's Cathedral, which had been standing there for 230-odd years on the highest ground in the city, with a dome of lead over an inner brick cone over an inner dome, and a great many voids and lofts and timber beams inside the structure where an incendiary could lodge unseen and burn quietly for an hour before anybody knew. The reason the cathedral is still there is a group of volunteers called the St. Paul's Watch. They were architects, mostly, and surveyors and staff and members of the congregation, and they had been organized at the beginning of the war on the very sensible principle that the building was too complicated to be defended by anybody who did not know it intimately. They had spent months learning the roof spaces and the stairs and the crawlways, working out where a bomb could fall and lodge, and stationing sand and pumps and water buckets at the right points. On the night of the 29th of December there were about 30 of them in the building, and they dealt with something like 28 incendiaries. One of those lodged in the outer lead of the dome itself and began to burn through in a place that nobody could reach. The accounts differ about exactly what happened next, and the version that everybody prefers is that as the lead melted, the bomb dropped through and fell inward onto the stone gallery where it could be put out. Whether it fell or was pushed, the effect was the same. The dome did not catch. And at some point that night, on the roof of a newspaper building a few streets away, a photographer looked west through the smoke and saw the dome standing clear above a bank of illuminated cloud with the burning streets around its base, and took a photograph that appeared 2 days later across a full page, under a headline calling it War's Greatest Picture. It is worth being slightly unromantic about it for a moment, because being unromantic makes it better rather than worse. The photograph is not a miracle. The dome is visible because it is on the highest ground in the city and because the fires beneath it were lighting the smoke from below. The cathedral survived because 30 tired people who had memorized its roof voids were standing in the right places with buckets. But the effect of that image on the country, and even more on America, which was watching all of this very closely and had not yet come into the war, was enormous, and it did more for the British case than any speech. The other consequence of that night was administrative and permanent. Within about a fortnight, fire watching became compulsory. Not voluntary, not encouraged, required. Every business premises had to be watched at night by somebody, and every man between certain ages had to register for fire guard duty, and later women too, and a rota was drawn up for every street. If your factory or your office or your shop was empty at night, that was now an offense. So from January 1941, the roofs of Britain were occupied. Every warehouse, every school, every church, every terrace of shops had somebody on it or under it, in a duffel coat with a flask and a bucket of sand and a stirrup pump, and in the better organized premises, a deck chair. Fire watching became the most widely shared experience of the war after queuing. It was overwhelmingly boring. Whole novels were read on rooftops. Card schools ran from midnight to 4. Enormous quantities of tea were drunk. And on the nights when it mattered, the same roofs that had burned in December were cleared of incendiaries in the first 2 minutes. And the fires never joined again in the same way, which is worth sitting with for a moment as an idea before we move on. The thing that saved the cities in the end was not a weapon. It was a rota. The winter went on. January and February were quieter, partly because of weather and partly because the effort was moving to the ports. And then the spring came and the raids came back heavier than ever. March and April of 1941 were, for a great many places, worse than the autumn had been. London took 2 very heavy attacks in the middle of April. one of which was for a while the largest raid of the war, and the streets of the West End that had felt relatively lucky up to that point stopped feeling lucky. By then, though, something had begun to change in the dark above the cities, and it is one of the few genuinely cheering technical stories of the period. At the start of the bombing, the night defenses did not work. The searchlights swept about, the guns fired at sound and estimate, and the night fighters went up and flew around in the dark, essentially hoping. In the first months, the number of bombers brought down at night was a rounding error against the number that came. The whole business was, in the honest words of the men involved, close to useless. What fixed it was a set of unglamorous developments arriving together over about 6 months. Radar sets small enough to fit inside an aircraft so that a fighter could be given eyes of its own. Ground control stations that could see both the bomber and the fighter on the same screen and talk the one onto the other. Guns fitted with radar-directed predictors so that they were aiming at something rather than at everything. And a great deal of very patient practice. The effect showed up in the figures in the spring of 1941 and then climbed steeply. In January, night fighters and guns together brought down a handful. By April, it was dozens. By May, the loss rate on a raid over Britain had risen to a level that would have made the campaign expensive to continue even if nothing else had changed. Something else, of course, had changed, and it was much larger, and it had nothing to do with Britain at all. The last night of the Blitz was the 10th of May, 1941, and it was the heaviest of them all. It was a Saturday again, which is one of those small symmetries that history throws up without meaning anything by it, and there was a full moon and a very low tide, the same combination that had made the December fire so difficult. Something over 500 bombers came to London and stayed for the whole short spring night, and they dropped high explosive and incendiaries in roughly equal measure, and around 2,200 separate fires were burning in London by the morning. Something like 1,436 people were killed, which is the highest figure for any single night of the war in Britain. A third of the streets of Greater London were impassable at dawn. Every railway terminus but one was closed. The docks were burning. Waterloo was out of action for days. The chamber of the House of Commons was destroyed, burned out entirely, the roof down into the benches. Westminster Abbey lost the lantern over the crossing, which came down in flames into the middle of the church. Westminster Hall, the great 11th century hall with the hammer-beam roof, was on fire at one end, and the firemen were faced with a choice of which building to save and chose the hall, which is the right answer, and was made in about 90 seconds by a man standing in the road at 3 a.m. The British Museum burned into bookstacks. St. Clement Danes in the Strand was gutted. And then the sun came up, and the smoke went up in a column over the whole of central London, and everybody prepared for the following night. And nothing came. Nothing came the next night either, or the night after that. There were small raids in the following weeks, scattered and unimpressive, and then, in the middle of June, the traffic across the Channel more or less stopped, and on the 22nd of June, 1941, the reason became clear, because on that day Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the air fleets that had been sitting on the airfields of northern France went east in their hundreds and did not come back. That is how the Blitz ended, not with a defeat, and not with a victory, and not with any single dramatic night. It ended because the aircraft were needed 2,000 miles away, and they simply left. For the people underneath it, The ending was not a moment, but a slow, disbelieving realization spread over about 6 weeks. People kept going down to the shelters. The underground platform stayed occupied all that summer by families who had been sleeping there since September and could not quite believe it was over, and some of them went on sleeping there, out of habit and out of a completely rational unwillingness to trust the quiet, into 1942. The all-clear kept being sounded for alerts that turned out to be nothing. And the sound of a single aircraft going over at night went on producing, in an enormous number of people, a small, involuntary tightening that took years to fade and in some cases never did. Now let me give you the accounting, because there should be an accounting, and then we will move on into the quiet years. Between the 7th of September, 1940, and the end of May 1941, something in the region of 43,000 civilians were killed by bombing in the United Kingdom, and about 139,000 were injured seriously enough to be recorded. A little under half of the deaths were in London. More than 1 million houses in London alone were damaged or destroyed, which is roughly 1 in 6 of every dwelling in the capital. And across the country, the figure for houses destroyed or made permanently uninhabitable ran into the hundreds of thousands. What it did not do was the thing it was for. It did not break the population, and this is the finding that emerged, reluctantly, from every study anybody made of it afterwards, on both sides. Production dipped after a heavy raid and recovered within days or weeks. Absenteeism rose and then fell. The bombing of a city center destroyed shops and houses and churches and left the factories on the outskirts, which is where the war work actually was, largely intact. Coventry's factories were back at something close to full output within about 6 weeks. Clydebank's shipyards never really stopped. And morale, which everybody had expected to be the weak point, turned out to be an extremely tough and rather boring substance. Not because people were brave in the film star sense, though a great many of them were, but because the alternative to going to work was not going to work, and the rent was still due, and the children still had to be fed. And the human animal is astonishingly good at continuing. I want to say a careful word here about the phrase that got attached to all this afterwards, because you will have heard it, and because it has been argued over for 80 years. The Blitz spirit as a phrase was largely constructed at the time, deliberately, by a government information machine and a press that had every reason to emphasize cheerfulness, and every reason to leave out the looting and the trekking and the class friction and the sheer grinding misery of the rest centers. It flattened an enormous variety of human responses into a single grinning image of a milkman picking his way over rubble, and that image has been used ever since, sometimes sincerely and sometimes cynically, to tell people to put up with things. And yet, the thing underneath the phrase is not nothing. Something did happen in those months that people who lived through them talked about for the rest of their lives, and it was not cheerfulness. It was a temporary and very unusual collapse of the ordinary distance between people. For about a year, in a great many streets, it stopped mattering very much who you were, because the only relevant facts about you were whether you could pump water, and whether you had a spare blanket, and whether you knew how many people slept in the back bedroom at number 11. People who had lived next door to each other for a decade without exchanging more than a nod spent 8 hours a night in a hole in the ground together and came out knowing each other's whole lives. That is a real thing, and it is worth separating from the poster version of it. It did not make anybody happy. It did not make the bombing worthwhile. But an enormous number of people came out of it with the settled conviction that the country they had been living in before had been unnecessarily cold, and that conviction did not evaporate when the raids stopped. It went into the ballot boxes in 1945, and into the plans for housing and health and schools that had been quietly drafted during the very worst of the bombing, in offices with the windows blown out, by civil servants who had spent the previous night on a roof with a bucket of sand. The bomb, it turns out, was a slow-acting political instrument, and it did not act in the direction anybody had intended. So we come to the middle years, which almost nobody tells you about, and which lasted longer than the bombing did. From the summer of 1941 until the beginning of 1944, Britain was a country that had been bombed and was not, on the whole, being bombed anymore, and had absolutely no way of knowing whether that would last until Thursday. And the strange thing about those 2.5 years is that the machinery of civil defense did not stand down. It could not. Everybody understood that the air fleets could come back at a fortnight's notice, so the wardens went on doing their nights. And the fire guards went on sitting on the roofs, and the blackout stayed absolute, and the shelters stayed open, and the whole apparatus sat there fully manned and almost entirely idle, year after year. Which meant that a very large number of people spent 1942 and 1943 in a state of permanent, low-grade, unrewarded readiness, which is one of the least dramatic and most exhausting conditions a human being can be put in. Enthusiasm sagged. Attendance at drills fell off. There were complaints in the local papers about wardens with nothing to do. And then, every so often, something would happen somewhere and the whole thing would tighten up again for a month. The raids that did come in that period had their own character, and there were 3 kinds worth knowing about. The first were the coastal hit-and-run attacks. Single aircraft or small groups coming in very low across the channel in daylight, under the radar cover, machine gunning and dropping a bomb or two on a seaside town and turning for home before anything could be scrambled. Places like Hastings and Eastbourne and Folkestone and Brighton got these repeatedly, and for the towns along that coast, they were in some ways harder to bear than the big raids because there was no warning at all. The siren went as the aircraft was overhead or afterwards. That whole shore, which had spent the 1930s as the country's holiday coast, spent the war behind barbed wire and mined beaches with its piers deliberately breached in the middle so that they could not be used as landing stages, and it did not really recover its holiday trade until the 1950s. The second kind were the Baedeker raids of the spring of 1942, which were named by everybody except the people who carried them out, after a series of tourist guidebooks. The idea, announced with a frankness that was itself remarkable, was to attack the most beautiful and least defended towns in Britain in retaliation for the bombing of German cities. So, in April and May of 1942, the bombers came for Exeter, and Bath, and Norwich, and York, and Canterbury. Bath is the one that always stops me. A Georgian city of honey-colored limestone terraces laid out in crescents and circuses in the 1700s with essentially no war industry, no docks, and almost no defenses, bombed on 2 consecutive nights at the end of April. The assembly rooms burned out. Streets of listed terraces came down. And the specific, awkward, lasting damage of that raid was not only what it destroyed, but what happened afterwards. because a great deal of the bomb-damaged Georgian fabric that could have been repaired was instead demolished in the 1950s and 60s by a city council in a modernizing mood, so that the losses of 2 nights in 1942 went on quietly growing for another 25 years. The third kind arrived in the first months of 1944 and was called, at the time and since, the Little Blitz, a concentrated series of raids on London between January and April, using new tactics and new aircraft, heavier bombs, and a much higher proportion of incendiaries. It was, by the standards of 1940, not enormous. By the standards of the previous 2 years, it was a shock, and it caught a city that had got out of the habit. People had to be reminded how to do it. Shelters that had been sitting unused since 1941 were opened up, pumped out, and found to contain a good deal of standing water and a certain amount of unauthorized bicycle storage. I should also, because we are being honest, tell you about the worst single loss of civilian life in Britain during the whole war, and it happened in a shelter in the middle of the quiet period, and no bomb was involved. On an evening in early March 1943, at the entrance to an underground station in the East End that was being used as a large public shelter, the sirens went, and a crowd began going down the steps in the usual way. There was one entrance, a flight of 19 steps down to a landing, wet with rain, with no handrail down the middle, and a single dim bulb. Nearby, in a park, a new type of anti-aircraft rocket battery fired for the first time, and the noise of it was unlike anything anybody there had heard before. And the people at the back of the crowd pushed forward. On the steps, somebody near the bottom lost their footing, and within a very few seconds the stairwell was blocked by fallen people, with the weight of the crowd still coming down behind them, and 173 people died there, most of them women and children. There was an inquiry, and its findings were suppressed for the rest of the war on the grounds that publishing them would damage morale and hand a gift to enemy propaganda, and the borough was quietly told to fit handrails and better lighting, and every other large shelter entrance in the country was quietly modified in the same way over the following months. The families were not told the full findings for a very long time, and the memorial that now stands at the top of those steps was put up by local people, from their own subscriptions, more than 70 years afterwards. I tell you that not to weigh the night down, but because it is true, and because it is the clearest possible illustration of a thing that runs through this entire story. That the great majority of what happened to civilians in those years happened in ordinary places, on stairs and in kitchens and in back gardens, and was decided by details as small as whether a stairwell had a handrail in the middle of it. Now, while all this was going on, the country itself was being rearranged at a speed that nothing in its history matched. Nearly every adult under 50 was doing something they had not been doing in 1938. Women were conscripted into war work from 1941, the first time in British history, into the factories and the services and the land army and the railways and the buses. Whole industries were moved out of the cities into shadow factories in market towns and disused mills and, in one celebrated case, a set of caves. Great tracts of countryside were taken over for airfields, of which more than 400 were built in a few years, mostly in the flat eastern counties, each one 3 runways in a triangle and a scatter of huts, so that by 1944 you could stand in a field in Lincolnshire and count the control towers. And through all of it, in every town and village, the rhythm of the blackout continued. 5 years of it. 5 years of taking down the frames in the morning and putting them up at dusk, of feeling your way along a garden wall, of trains crawling into unlit stations where a porter walked the platform calling the name of the place because you could not read the sign. It is the single longest-running physical change to daily life in the whole war, and when people were asked afterwards what they had hated most, it was very often not the bombing. It was the dark. And then, in the summer of 1944, when everybody in Britain had allowed themselves to believe that the worst was 4 years behind them, the sky produced something new. The invasion of Normandy went in at the beginning of June. For a week the whole country was thinking about the beaches and the weather in the Channel. And then, in the small hours of a night in the middle of that month, a handful of very small aircraft came in over Kent making an extraordinary noise, and one of them fell on a railway bridge in Bethnal Green. And the last phase of the bombing of Britain began. They were not aircraft. They were flying bombs. A small, pilotless machine with stubby wings, a warhead of about a ton in the nose, and a pulse jet engine mounted above the tail that produced a harsh, rattling, buzzing roar quite unlike anything else that had ever flown over England. They were launched from ramps in northern France and later from the Low Countries. They flew at around 2,000 feet at nearly 400 miles an hour, and they were aimed, very approximately, at London. Everybody who lived under them describes the same two sounds, and they describe them in the same order. The first is the engine, a coarse, ripping buzz arriving from the southeast, getting louder, and everybody in the street stopping what they were doing to listen to it. The second is the silence. When the machine had flown its set distance, the fuel was cut and the engine stopped, and the thing tipped over and came down, and there was somewhere between 5 and 15 seconds between the engine stopping and the explosion. So the rule that the whole of southern England learned within about a week was the exact opposite of every instinct. While you could hear it, you were safe. It was when it went quiet that you took cover. You can imagine what that did to a population's nerves after 5 years. People stopped mid-sentence in shops. Whole bus queues turned their heads together. And unlike 1940, this went on all day as well as all night, because a machine with no crew does not need darkness, so there was no evening rhythm to it at all, no going down at 9 and coming up at 5, just a random distribution of that buzzing across the whole 24 hours for months. Around 10,000 of them were launched at Britain. Something over 2,400 reached the London area. They killed about 6,000 people and made a great many more homeless, and because they arrived in daylight into working districts, and because the warhead was designed for blast rather than penetration, the damage pattern was distinctive, enormous, shallow destruction of housing over a wide radius. Thousands of roofs stripped and windows gone across whole neighborhoods from a single one. And so, for the second time, London emptied. 1.5 million people left the capital in the summer of 1944, most of them women and children, in the last great evacuation of the war, and it was, in its way, sadder than the first one. Because in September 1939, everybody had been frightened and determined, and in the summer of 1944, everybody was simply tired, and had believed it was nearly over and was being asked to pack the case again. Underneath, the shelters filled up once more. The underground platforms that had been half empty for 3 years were full again by July. The deep shelters that had been dug in 1941 and used for offices were finally opened to the public for their intended purpose, and were, by all accounts, very good indeed, dry, warm, quiet, with proper bunks and canteens and medical posts about 100 feet down, so that nothing on the surface could be heard at all. They were 3 years late, and it worked perfectly, which is a sentence that could be written about a great deal of British public administration. The defense against the flying bomb is one of the neatest engineering stories of the war, and it makes a good, calm thing to listen to, because it is essentially a problem of arrangement. At first, the defenses were laid out the way they had been for years: guns around London, fighters between the coast and the capital, balloons in the middle. This was, it turned out, exactly wrong, because the fighters were flying into their own gunfire, and the guns could not fire freely with fighters overhead. So in the middle of July, in about a week, the entire air defense of southern England was picked up and moved. Every anti-aircraft gun in the country that could be spared was hauled down to a continuous belt along the Channel coast. More than 1,000 of them, with their radar and predictors. The fighters were given the sea in front of the belt, and the balloons were massed in a great final curtain on the North Downs. Some 2,000 of them. It was an enormous physical undertaking. Thousands of lorries and tons of concrete and cable done in days on ground that was mostly Kent and Sussex farmland, and its effect was immediate. The layers stopped interfering with each other. And at the same moment, 3 technical things arrived in the gun belt more or less together: a new radar set that could track a small, fast target properly, an electrical predictor that could work out the aim automatically, and a shell with a small radar fuse in the nose that exploded when it came near the target instead of needing a direct hit. The combination changed the numbers completely. In the first weeks, the guns had been bringing down perhaps 1 flying bomb in 20. By the last week of August, they were bringing down more than 4 and 5 of everything that came within reach, and on one remarkable day, almost every machine launched at London was destroyed over the sea or the fields of Kent. The fighters had their own answers. The fastest aircraft available were stripped of paint and polished and given tuned engines to squeeze out the few extra miles an hour needed to catch a machine doing nearly 400, and the pilots learned to attack from above and behind. And a small number of them worked out that you could slide a wingtip under the flying bomb's wing and tip it over, upsetting its gyroscope so that it dived into open country, a maneuver requiring a degree of confidence that is difficult to overstate. By the beginning of September, the launching sites in the Pas-de-Calais had been overrun by the advancing armies, and the flying bombs stopped coming from France. A reduced number went on being launched from aircraft over the North Sea, and later from sites in the Netherlands, all through the winter, and the last one of all fell in Kent in the final week of March, 1945. The country breathed out. The evacuees began coming home again. The papers began, cautiously, to talk about the end. And then, on a quiet evening at the beginning of September 1944, a suburban street in West London was destroyed by an explosion that had no warning of any kind, no siren, no engine, no whistle, nothing at all, and the sound of it, when it finally arrived, came afterwards. The last weapon of the war to fall on Britain was a rocket, and it was a genuinely new thing in the world. It stood some 46 feet high, weighed 13 tons on the pad, burned alcohol and liquid oxygen, and carried a warhead of about a ton. Launched from a portable stand in a wood or a park or a suburban street in the Netherlands, it went almost straight up out of the atmosphere altogether to a height of some 50 or 60 miles. And then came down on the far end of its arc at around 3,000 miles an hour, which is several times the speed of its own sound. That last fact is the whole character of it. There was no possible warning, no siren, because there was nothing to see coming, no engine note, because the engine had shut down 5 minutes earlier over the North Sea. Nothing at all, and then an explosion, and then, a few seconds later, the double crack of the rocket's own arrival catching up with itself, followed by a strange tearing rushing noise, which is the sound of the whole flight arriving in the wrong order. Nothing could be done about it, and that was the difficult part. Against bombers, you could put up fighters. Against the flying bomb, you could put up a gun belt and a balloon curtain and shoot 4 out of 5 of them into the sea. Against something falling out of the edge of space at 3,000 miles an hour there was, in 1944, no defense whatsoever. The only counter was to overrun the launching areas, which the armies eventually did, and to bomb the supply lines, which was of limited use because the whole system was designed to be mobile, a rocket, a trailer, a generator lorry, and a crew of a few dozen could arrive in a clearing, set up, launch, and be gone within a couple of hours. The government, for the first 2 months, did not admit that they existed. The official explanation for the explosions was a series of gas main failures, which nobody in southeast London believed for more than about a fortnight, particularly since the gas mains in question appeared to be exploding at a rate of several a day and always at the top of a very deep crater. The phrase entered the local slang immediately, and people took to referring to the things as flying gas pipes, which is a very good example of the specific quality of humor that this whole period produced, dry, faintly exasperated, and completely unimpressed. Something over 1,000 of them fell on Britain, more than 500 on the London area, spread from September 1944 to the end of March 1945. They killed nearly 3,000 people. Because they came down at random into whatever was underneath, the individual incidents could be terrible. One fell on a crowded department store in New Cross on a Saturday lunchtime in November, and another on a working men's club, and another on a market. And because nothing announced them, the ordinary defensive rituals of the previous 5 years, the going down and the coming up, had no purchase at all. You could not shelter from a thing you would never hear. What people did instead was, in a way, the most remarkable adaptation of the whole war. They decided not to think about it. The reports of the wartime observers through that winter are full of the same finding, which is that most Londoners, after the first fortnight, made an entirely conscious decision to carry on exactly as before on the grounds that there was nothing else available. Shelter use went down during the rocket period. Cinema attendance stayed high. It was fatalism, and it was rational fatalism, and it is not the same thing as courage, but it is not far off. The last rocket to fall on Britain came down on the morning of the 27th of March, 1945, on a block of flats in Orpington in Kent, and one woman was killed there. And she was the last British civilian to die from enemy action in the war. Her name is on a plaque now on the wall of the building that stands in that place, and she has the melancholy distinction of being the end of a list that had begun over Great Yarmouth 30 years earlier. The last flying bomb had come down 2 days earlier, in Hertfordshire, and that, apart from a few isolated alerts, was the end. 6 years, and then it simply stopped. The all clear that mattered most sounded across London on the 6th of May, 1945, the last one, the long study note, and this time it meant it. There is a wonderful small detail from that week which I have always liked, which is that the Civil Defense Organization stood down formally in early May, and the wardens handed in their helmets and their armbands and their whistles at the town halls, and a very large number of them, having spent 5.5 years complaining about the job, went home and found the house extremely quiet. The lights came back before the war ended, and it happened in stages. And each stage was a small national event. In September 1944, with the flying bomb sites overrun, the full blackout was relaxed into what was officially called a dim out. You could now have curtains that let a little light through, as long as the glow was no brighter than moonlight, and street lamps came back at a reduced level in most of the country. The effect on people who had spent 5 years in the absolute dark was completely out of proportion to the actual quantity of light involved. Crowds went out to look at lit shop windows. Children of 5 and 6 were taken out specially to see a street lamp, having never in their lives seen one working. Then, in late April 1945, the blackout ended altogether. And the coastal towns took down the shutters, and the clock tower at Westminster was lit again for the first time since 1939. And the sound of the bell had never stopped. But now you could see the faces of the clock glowing over the river again, and people stood on the bridges to watch it. And on the 8th of May, 1945, the war in Europe ended, and the country did the thing it had been saving up for 6 years. Trestle tables came out into the middle of thousands of residential streets. Bunting came out of lofts and drawers where it had been since the coronation. There were bonfires on the bomb sites, made of the last of the blackout frames and the wooden shoring from the wrecked houses. And in a good many of them, an effigy went on the top. Pubs ran dry by the evening. The floodlights went on over the public buildings in every city, and in London the crowds went down to the palace and the square and stood there in the light, and a very large number of the photographs of that night show the same thing. People not celebrating exactly, but looking up at buildings they had not seen properly lit since they were young. And then, in the morning, the country turned around and looked at what it had. What it had was a housing problem of a size that no British government had ever faced. Across the country, something like 4 million homes had been damaged by bombing in one degree or another out of a national stock of about 12.5 million. Around 500,000 had been destroyed outright or damaged so badly that they were never going to be lived in again. And on top of that sat all the houses that had not been touched by a single bomb, but had simply not been repaired since 1939, because there had been no materials and no labor, so that by 1945 a great deal of British housing was quietly falling apart from 6 years of no maintenance whatsoever. Slates missing, gutters rotted, damp coming up walls that had needed pointing since the coronation. Into that came the demobilization, and with it a very large number of young men and women who had spent 5 years away and now wanted a house, and within about a year, the highest birth rate the country had seen in a generation. The first answer was temporary, and it was, like the shelter and the table, an object rather than a policy. It was the prefabricated bungalow, and Britain built about 156,000 of them. They arrived on lorries and sections and were bolted together on a concrete raft in a day or two, sometimes by German and Italian prisoners of war who were still in the country waiting to be sent home. They were single-story with 2 bedrooms, a living room, and at the front a fitted kitchen and a proper bathroom with a heated towel rail and a built-in refrigerator. All of it made as a single molded unit and slotted in. They were officially designed to last 10 years, and people, on the whole, adored them. That is not the reaction the planners expected, and it is well documented. Families moving out of a shared upstairs back room with a cold tap on the landing and a lavatory in the yard found themselves with a hot water system, and indoor bathroom, a garden front and back, and a front door of their own. Prefab estates went up on bomb sites and playing fields in the edges of parks in straight, cheerful rows, and their occupants planted the gardens with a determination that turned some of those estates into small horticultural showpieces within about 3 summers. When the councils came round in the 1960s to demolish them at the end of their 10-year life, they met organized resistance in a good many places, and a handful of prefabs are still standing today, listed and cared for with the original heated towel rail. Behind the prefab came the permanent rebuilding, and it was governed by a set of plans that had been drawn up remarkably during the bombing itself. That is one of the things about this period that most surprises people. The planning for what would replace the destroyed cities began while they were still being destroyed. A plan for the County of London was published in 1943, in the middle of the war, proposing a rebuilt capital of distinct communities separated by open space, ringed with a green belt. Its traffic on new roads, its bombed districts rebuilt at lower densities with light and air. Coventry's city architect had a complete plan for a new center with a pedestrian shopping precinct ready within weeks of the raid that flattened the old one, which he had, it must be said, largely drafted beforehand, having taken the view some years earlier that the medieval street pattern was a nuisance to motor traffic. And so from 1945 onwards, the bombed cities were rebuilt according to ideas that had been fashionable in the 1930s and were being applied at a scale their authors had never imagined. Ring roads went round the old centers. Shopping precincts replaced the market streets. Tower blocks replaced the terraces. On the entirely sincere argument that a family with a bathroom on the 11th floor was better housed than a family with a copper and a mangle in a yard, which for a considerable number of families was, at the time, simply true. New towns were designated in a ring around London and elsewhere, at Stevenage and Crawley and Harlow and Basildon and Corby and East Kilbride, and a dozen more. And by the 1960s, a couple of million people had moved out of the old inner districts into them. The results are still being argued about, and I am not going to settle it tonight in a bedtime story. Some of it was very good, some of it was ruinous, and knocked down a great deal more than the bombing ever had, and severed street patterns that had been in place since the Middle Ages, and put a dual carriageway through the middle of towns that had survived everything else. What is worth holding on to is simply this: an enormous amount of what a British town centre looks like today was determined by decisions made between 1943 and 1955 by people working in a state of emergency, and if you have ever wondered why the medieval church in your town stands marooned on a traffic island, that is very often the reason. The churches themselves make a small chapter of their own. In the city of London alone, most of Wren's parish churches had been gutted. Some were rebuilt exactly as they had been, at enormous cost and with enormous care over the following 20 years. Some were rebuilt inside their surviving walls in a plainer modern manner. Some were left as ruins on purpose and turned into gardens, which is one of the loveliest things the post-war city did. You can walk into a roofless nave in the middle of the financial district on a weekday lunchtime and find office workers eating sandwiches among the fig trees, with the tower still standing above them and the sky where the roof was. And one of them was taken down stone by numbered stone in the 1960s, shipped across the Atlantic, and rebuilt on a college campus in Missouri, where it stands today, which is an extremely strange fate for a Wren church and a story that always makes me smile. The greatest of the rebuilding stories, though, is the one that started with the 2 charred beams and the 2 words on the wall. Coventry decided, after a long and genuinely contentious argument, not to restore its bombed cathedral and not to clear it away, but to keep the ruin exactly as the fire had left it, roofless and open, as a permanent memorial, and to build the new cathedral immediately beside it at right angles, joined by a huge screen of clear glass engraved with figures, so that from inside the new building you look straight out through the saints into the old one. It was consecrated in the spring of 1962, and a piece of music written for the occasion set the Latin Mass for the dead against the poems of a young man killed in the trenches of the previous war, and was performed with singers from Britain and Germany and Russia standing together in the new nave, which was the entire point and was understood as such by everybody in the building. But long before any of the rebuilding happened, there were the bomb sites, and the bomb sites lasted for decades, and they became one of the defining landscapes of British childhood in the middle of the 20th century. A bomb site is not a ruin. A ruin has walls. A bomb site is what is left after the walls have been pulled down for safety and the useful materials taken away. A rectangle of cleared ground the exact shape of the building that stood there, sunk a few feet below pavement level because the cellars were left in place and filled with rubble, with the party walls of the neighbors on either side showing the ghost of the missing house in wallpaper and fireplaces and a diagonal line of plaster where the staircase had been. There were tens of thousands of them, and they sat there, not for a year or two, for 20, 30, 40 years in some cases. Land ownership was tangled, compensation was slow, building licenses were rationed until the mid-1950s, and there was no money. So the gaps stayed, and the country went about its business around them, and the gaps filled up with 3 things. The first was plants, and this is my favorite part of the entire aftermath. Within 2 summers, the bomb sites of London were covered in Rose Bay willowherb, a tall, straight, magenta-pink flower that grows waist to shoulder high and produces a fine drifting seed. It is a plant that specializes in ground that has recently burned, and before the war it was uncommon in southern England. A thing you found in a few damp northern woods. After 1941 it was everywhere, in great pink drifts across whole streets of cleared cellars, so that by the last summers of the war a person standing on a rooftop in the city could look out across acres of flowering pink where the warehouses had been. Londoners named it bombweed and fireweed, and it is still one of the commonest plants in Britain, and it is common because of this. With it came Oxford ragwort, a bright yellow daisy that had escaped from a botanic garden in the 1700s and spread along the railway lines because its seed likes the drought of passing trains. It found the bomb sites, broken stone very much to its taste, and went everywhere. And with them came Buddleia, the purple butterfly bush, which will root in a crack in a wall with no soil at all, and which colonized the standing gables and chimney stacks so thoroughly that it is now a permanent feature of every railway cutting and derelict wall in the country. Botanists surveyed the sites through the 1940s and counted more than 150 wild species growing in the middle of the City of London, including several that had not been recorded there for a century. And with the plants came the birds. The black redstart, a small dark bird that in its native range nests on cliffs and screes, discovered that a bomb site is an excellent cliff, and settled into central London and the other bombed cities in numbers it had never previously reached in Britain, and sang from the tops of ruined walls in the early mornings. The second thing the sites filled up with was children. Every account of growing up in a British city in the 1940s and 50s has bomb sites in it, and they were, by any modern standard, the most spectacularly dangerous playground ever provided to a generation. And children loved them with an intensity that nothing since has matched. They were dens, forts, jungles, battlefields, football pitches, and a limitless source of raw material. Whole social hierarchies were built on who controlled which site. The static water tanks were swum in illegally and constantly. Bricks were stacked into structures. Shrapnel collections started in the war were still being traded in the 1950s. And the third thing was cars, which arrived in the 1950s, and which is why a surprising number of small awkward car parks in British city centers are exactly the shape of a Victorian building, and why the ones that were later built on are so often occupied by something in a completely different style and scale from the terrace around them. Once you know to look for it, you can read the bombing off the fronts of British streets almost anywhere. A row of 19th century houses with a 1950s block in the middle of it, or a run of shops interrupted by one flat-fronted infill, or a church tower standing alone in a garden with no church behind it. There is other evidence, too, if you like this kind of thing, and it is everywhere once you have your eye in. There is the shrapnel scarring, hundreds of small chips and pocks across one face of a stone wall or a railway bridge or the pedestal of a statue, all of them fanning outward from the same point, which is the fingerprint of a single explosion in the road. You can find it on the walls of the great museums in South Kensington and on the Tate, and on countless ordinary bridges and boundary walls in every bombed city. There are the sawn-off stumps of railings on top of thousands of front garden walls, from the scrap collection. There are the fire hydrant markers and the little yellow signs on gable ends. There are the Anderson shelters, an unknown but substantial number of which are still standing in British back gardens. Dug out after the war, turned upright, and pressed into 80 years of service as tool sheds, coal stores, and greenhouses, quietly rusting under the ivy. There are the deep shelters, still down there under the northern line, dry and empty and enormous. There are the pillboxes in the fields, of which thousands survive because concrete is tedious to remove and farmers have other things to do. There are the disused airfields in the eastern counties, where a straight stretch of unusually wide farm track running for a mile through a beet field is an old runway, and where the control tower is sometimes still standing at the edge of the crops. And underneath all of it there is a layer in the ground, a foot or two down in the bombed districts, of crushed brick and mortar and melted glass, which the archaeologists who dig in British cities now treat as a perfectly ordinary stratum, the way they treat the layer of the Great Fire of 1666 a few feet lower down. When they were clearing the cellars in the city in the late 40s, the archaeologists went in ahead of the builders and found, underneath the bombed warehouses, the Roman city, temples, a fort, mosaic floors, and long stretches of the original wall, which had been sitting under the Victorian buildings unseen for centuries and which nobody would have got at for another 500 years if the buildings had not come down. Which is a genuinely strange thought to end the practical part of the story on, that the bombing of London is the reason we know what Roman London looked like. So let us go back one last time and stand in the whole shape of it, from one end to the other, the way you would stand back from a long painting in a gallery when you have finished walking along it. It begins with 4 people killed on a January night in Norfolk in 1915 by a thing floating over the salt marshes that nobody in the history of these islands had ever had to think about before. It goes through 25 years of dread and committee papers about coffins and a man telling the House of Commons that nothing could stop the bomber. It goes through 38 million rubber masks in cardboard boxes and 2.25 million steel arches buried in back gardens under marrows, and 1.5 million children with luggage labels on their coats, and the first siren of the war sounding over London on a Sunday morning in September 1939 for what turned out to be a false alarm. It goes through 57 nights over London, one after another without a break, and the timber yards at Surrey Docks and the Caramel set solid across the roads in Silvertown, through cribbage in a hole in the ground, and the rolled blanket that reserved your place on the platform, and the refreshment train coming through the tunnel with cocoa at midnight. Through wardens who knew which house had the old man on the top floor, through 30 men standing perfectly still on a pile of brick listening for tapping, through a spire in Coventry and 2 charred beams tied into a cross and a word cut into a wall with no object after it, through a dome above the smoke kept there by volunteers who had memorized the roof, through the 10th of May, 1941, and then a silence that nobody trusted for years, through 2.5 seasons of unrewarded waiting, through the buzzing that meant you were safe and the silence that meant you were not, through a rocket falling out of the top of the sky onto a block of flats in Kent on a March morning in 1945, and one woman at the end of a list that had started 30 years before her, through the clock faces at Westminster lighting up again, and the trestle tables coming out into the road, and then out the far side into pink willowherb standing shoulder high over the cellars, and small dark birds singing off the tops of broken walls, and children building forts in the ruins of the world their parents had grown up in. Almost everybody in that story is gone now. That is simply what happens. It is not sad in any sharp way at this distance. It is just the arithmetic of 80-odd years. The wardens are gone, and the rescue men who could read a collapsed house by looking at it, and the women who poured tea out of the side of a van for 4 hours at a stretch, and the children who traded shrapnel in the playground. The last of them are very old now, and the rest have gone quietly and in their own beds, which is exactly what all that shoveling and shoring and pumping was for. But the ground remembers it, and that part is still there, and it will be there long after tonight. It is in the layer of crushed brick and melted glass a foot or two down under half the streets of half the cities in Britain, sitting patiently above the Roman wall and below the tarmac. It is in the pox stonework on the museum walls in Kensington, where you can still trace the fan of a single explosion outward from a point in the road. It is in the sawn-off stumps of iron on top of a garden wall in a suburb where nothing else ever happened. It is in the one flat-fronted building in the middle of a Victorian terrace, and the church tower standing in a garden with roses where the nave was, and the odd little car park that is exactly the footprint of a warehouse. It is in a rusted steel arch at the bottom of somebody's garden in Ilford with a lawnmower in it and ivy over the top. It is in the willow herb, which is now one of the commonest wildflowers in these islands and will be flowering pink along every railway embankment in the country this summer, entirely indifferent to why. None of it needs anything from you. That is, I think, the most restful fact of all, and it is worth taking with you into sleep. All of it is finished. Every one of those 57 nights ended. Every all clear was sounded, including the last one. The lamps went back on, the tables came out into the road, the buildings went up again, and the people who did all the digging and the listening and the pouring of tea have long since put down their buckets and gone to bed. It went on for 6 years, and it stopped, and the ground took it, and the flowers came, and the birds came. And the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning closed over it the way water closes over a stone. History does not disappear. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet, and then somebody builds a bus shelter on it and waits for the number 12 in the rain and thinks about their dinner. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet story waiting for you on the screen, and it will keep going for as long as you need it to. And if you found this one restful, you are very welcome to leave a like or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and only once you have slept, because sleep comes first and always has. If you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments before you go, so that somebody else lying awake somewhere in the world can scroll past and know they are not the only one. There is nothing left to follow now. You do not need to remember any of it. The dates will keep, the names will keep. The willow herb will still be flowering in the morning whether either of us thinks about it or not. So let your shoulders go one last inch. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands lie open and heavy. Let the whole of today go, all of it, the useful parts and the useless parts alike, down through the mattress and away. Somewhere out there the lamps are on, and the streets are quiet, and the sky over these islands is doing nothing at all except holding a few stars and a bit of weather, exactly as it did for 1,000 years before any of this, and exactly as it's done every night since. Close your eyes now. Good night, and sweet dreams.